A millionaire cared for his blind son for 20 years, until one day, suspecting something, he decided to install cameras at home, and what he saw in the recordings left him in shock. The sun's first rays crept through the ornate windows of the Blackwood mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Alexander Blackwood stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his eyes fixed on the closed door of his son's bedroom. The silence that enveloped the house was almost palpable, broken only by the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the foyer. Alexander's fingers drummed against the polished banister, a subtle betrayal of the tension that coursed through his body. At 55, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that spoke of wisdom earned through years of cutthroat business dealings. But this morning, as he waited for his son to emerge, he felt every bit his age and then some. The door creaked open, and out stepped Ethan Blackwood, Alexander's pride and joy, and his greatest source of guilt. At 25, Ethan moved with a grace that belied his supposed blindness, his hand barely skimming the wall as he made his way down the hallway. "Good morning, Dad," Ethan called out, his voice warm, but carrying an undercurrent of something Alexander couldn't quite place. Was it hesitation? Guilt? Or was he just projecting his own tumultuous emotions onto his son? "Morning, son," Alexander replied, his tone carefully modulated to betray nothing of the storm brewing within him. "Sleep well?" Ethan's lips quirked in a half-smile as he reached the bottom of the stairs. "Like a baby. You know me, always the sound sleeper." Alexander watched as Ethan navigated the foyer with ease, making his way to the dining room where breakfast awaited. It was a path he had walked countless times over the years, yet something about Ethan's movements today seemed different, more assured, perhaps? Or was that just Alexander's imagination, fueled by the doubts that had been gnawing at him for weeks? As they settled into their usual seats at the massive oak dining table, Alexander couldn't help but study his son's face. Ethan's eyes, a striking blue that had once sparkled with mischief and life, now stared vacantly ahead. Or so Alexander had always believed, but lately he'd noticed subtle shifts in Ethan's gaze, fleeting moments when those eyes seemed to focus on something just beyond Alexander's shoulder. "So, what's on the agenda for today?" Ethan asked, reaching for a piece of toast with unerring accuracy. "Any big meetings at Blackwood Enterprises?" Alexander cleared his throat, pushing aside his suspicions for the moment. "Actually, yes. We're finalizing the details for the merger with Hartley Industries. It's a big day for the company." Ethan nodded, a look of interest crossing his features. "Sounds exciting. I remember you mentioning Hartley Industries before. They're in renewable energy, right?" "That's right," Alexander confirmed, a note of pride creeping into his voice. "If this merger goes through, we'll be at the forefront of green technology development in the country." As he spoke, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at his son's memory and grasp of the business world. Despite his disability, or perhaps because of it, Ethan had developed an almost uncanny ability to retain information. It was one of the many ways he'd adapted to his condition over the years, finding workarounds and developing new skills to compensate for his lack of sight. Or at least, that's what Alexander had always believed. "You know, Dad," Ethan said, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone, "I've been thinking a lot about the company lately, about my place in it." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. This was a topic they'd danced around for years, never quite addressing head-on. "Oh?" he managed, trying to keep his voice neutral. Ethan set down his fork, his expression serious. "I know I can't exactly follow in your footsteps, given my condition, but I want to contribute somehow. I've been studying business theory, economics, anything I can get my hands on in Braille or audiobook format. I think I could be an asset to Blackwood Enterprises, even if it's just in an advisory capacity." The earnestness in Ethan's voice hit Alexander like a physical blow. Here was his son, so determined to prove his worth, to carve out a place for himself in a world that had dealt him such a cruel hand. And all the while Alexander sat across from him, harboring suspicions that could shatter the very foundation of their relationship. That's wonderful, Ethan," Alexander managed, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll certainly discuss it further. Your insights would be invaluable." As the words left his mouth, Alexander was struck by their potential double meaning. Ethan's insights had always been sharp, his understanding of complex business concepts far beyond what one might expect from someone cut off from visual learning. Had Alexander been blind himself, willfully ignoring the signs that had been there all along? The rest of breakfast passed in a blur of small talk and carefully avoided subjects. As Ethan excused himself to go to his study, a room filled with braille books and specially adapted technology, Alexander remained at the table, lost in thought. He recalled the day of the accident, nearly 2 decades ago. Ethan, just a boy of 6, had fallen into the Olympic-sized pool in the backyard. By the time Alexander had pulled him out, Ethan wasn't breathing. The next few hours were a nightmarish blur of ambulance sirens, hospital corridors, and grim-faced doctors. When Ethan had finally opened his eyes, the light that had once danced in them was gone. The doctors had called it cortical blindness, a result of oxygen deprivation to the brain. They had held out hope for recovery, but as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, that hope had faded. Or had it? Alexander rose from the table, his decision made. He couldn't go on like this, torn between suspicion and guilt. He needed answers, even if those answers threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about his son, about their life together. With a heavy heart, he made his way to his study. There, hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk, was a small box containing several tiny high-tech cameras. He had purchased them weeks ago but had hesitated to use them, feeling like a traitor to his own flesh and blood. Now, as he held one of the cameras in his palm, Alexander felt the weight of his choices bearing down on him. Was he really prepared to spy on his own son, to potentially uncover a lie that had spanned 2 decades? But as he recalled Ethan's words at breakfast, the passion in his voice as he spoke of contributing to the company, Alexander knew he had no choice. If Ethan had been deceiving him all these years, he needed to know why. And if by some miracle his suspicions were unfounded, then perhaps he could finally lay his guilt to rest. With trembling hands, Alexander pocketed the cameras. He would plant them throughout the house while Ethan was in his study, and then he would wait and watch and pray that the truth, whatever it might be, would set them both free from the gilded cage they had built around themselves. As he left his study, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of a life-altering discovery. Little did he know, the revelations that awaited him would shake the very foundations of his world, unraveling secrets far beyond Ethan's supposed blindness. Secrets that would force both father and son to confront the lies that had shaped their lives for far too long. The soft whir of the air conditioning system was the only sound that broke the tense silence in Alexander Blackwood's home office. His eyes, bloodshot from hours of staring at the computer screen, darted between multiple camera feeds displayed before him. Each window showed a different part of the sprawling mansion: the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, and most importantly, Ethan's private study. For 3 days, Alexander had been living a double life. By day, he was the doting father and successful businessman, going through the motions of his normal routine. But by night, he transformed into a silent observer, scrutinizing every move his son made when he thought no one was watching. As the clock on his desk ticked past midnight, Alexander's weary eyes caught a flicker of movement on one of the screens. Ethan was leaving his bedroom, moving with a surety that sent a chill down Alexander's spine. There was no hesitation in his son's steps, no cautious hand outstretched to feel for obstacles. Ethan navigated the darkened hallway as if he could see every shadow, every contour. Alexander leaned closer to the screen, his heart pounding. He watched as Ethan made his way to the library, a room filled floor to ceiling with books that ostensibly he could never read. With bated breath, Alexander switched to the library feed, waiting to see what would happen next. What he witnessed in the next few minutes shattered the last remnants of his denial. Ethan approached one of the towering bookshelves, his fingers skimming the spines of the books, not with the tentative touch of a blind man reading Braille, but with the purposeful search of someone looking for a specific title. After a moment, he pulled out a large leather-bound volume, a first edition of The Great Gatsby that Alexander had gifted him years ago, never imagining he'd be able to appreciate its beauty. As Ethan settled into an armchair, book in hand, Alexander felt a mix of emotions surge through him: shock, betrayal, anger, and underneath it all, a perverse sense of relief. His suspicions hadn't been unfounded after all, but the confirmation brought him no joy, only a deep, aching sense of loss. For nearly an hour, Alexander watched as Ethan read, his eyes moving across the pages with unmistakable focus. Occasionally, Ethan would pause, squint, or bring the book closer to his face, suggesting that his vision, while present, was far from perfect. But there was no denying the truth any longer. Ethan could see. As the reality of the situation sank in, Alexander's mind raced with questions. How long had this deception been going on? Why would Ethan maintain such an elaborate lie? And perhaps most painfully, how had he, as a father, been so blind to the truth? The sound of a book snapping shut jolted Alexander back to the present. On the screen, Ethan was returning The Great Gatsby to its place on the shelf. But instead of heading back to his room, he made his way to the French doors leading to the backyard. Alexander switched feeds again, following his son's progress through the garden. The full moon cast an ethereal glow over the manicured lawns and carefully tended flower beds. Ethan moved through this silver-tinged world with ease, pausing occasionally to touch a bloom or inhale the night air. As Ethan approached the Olympic-sized pool, the site of the accident that had supposedly robbed him of his sight, Alexander felt his chest tighten. He watched, barely breathing, as Ethan stood at the pool's edge, gazing into its still waters. For a long moment, Ethan remained motionless, a solitary figure bathed in moonlight. Then, to Alexander's astonishment, he began to remove his clothes. First his shirt, then his pants, until he stood naked at the pool's edge, his pale skin almost luminous in the darkness. With a grace that spoke of years of hidden practice, Ethan dove into the pool. Alexander watched, transfixed, as his son cut through the water with powerful strokes, his movements fluid and assured. This was no blind man feeling his way through the water. This was a skilled swimmer, one who had clearly spent countless secret hours honing his abilities. As Ethan completed lap after lap, Alexander felt tears begin to roll down his cheeks. The enormity of the lie, the years of deception, crashed over him like a tidal wave. How many nights had Ethan sneaked out here, swimming under the cover of darkness? How many other secrets was he hiding? After what seemed like an eternity, Ethan finally emerged from the pool, water cascading off his lean frame. He stood for a moment, face tilted up to the sky, before reaching for a towel he had apparently hidden nearby. As he dried himself off, Alexander could see a small smile playing on his son's lips, a smile of satisfaction, of freedom. It was a smile Alexander had never seen before, and its presence on his son's face felt like a knife twisting in his gut. Suddenly, Alexander couldn't bear to watch any longer. He switched off the monitors, plunging his office into darkness. In the silence that followed, he could hear his own ragged breathing, could feel the rapid pounding of his heart. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Confront Ethan? Pretend he had never discovered the truth? The thought of continuing this charade, of playing along with Ethan's deception, made Alexander feel physically ill. But the alternative, a confrontation that would irrevocably change their relationship, seemed equally daunting. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Alexander made his way to his bedroom on unsteady legs. He hadn't slept in days, and the weight of his discovery pressed down on him like a physical force. But sleep, he knew, would be elusive. Lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, Alexander's mind wandered to the future. The merger with Hartley Industries, once so important, now seemed trivial in comparison to the crisis unfolding within his own home. How could he focus on business when his entire personal life felt like it was built on quicksand? And yet, as the CEO of Blackwood Enterprises, he couldn't simply check out. The merger was too important, the stakes too high. Thousands of jobs depended on its success, not to mention the potential impact on clean energy development. Alexander knew he would have to find a way to compartmentalize, to keep his personal turmoil from affecting his professional judgment. But even as he tried to focus on the upcoming board meeting, his thoughts kept circling back to Ethan. What would happen when they sat across from each other at the breakfast table in a few short hours? How could he look into those eyes he now knew could see, and pretend nothing had changed? As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the room in warm hues, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't confront Ethan, not yet. He needed time to process, to plan his next move carefully. For now he would continue the charade, playing the role of the unsuspecting father, while he grappled with the implications of what he had discovered. With a heavy sigh, Alexander dragged himself out of bed and into the shower. As the hot water cascaded over him, he tried to steel himself for the day ahead. He had meetings to attend, a company to run, a merger to finalize, and all the while, he would be carrying the weight of this explosive secret. As he dressed in one of his impeccably tailored suits, armor for the corporate battlefield, Alexander caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked older, more careworn than he had just days ago. The knowledge he now possessed had aged him, etching new lines of worry onto his face. Taking a deep breath, Alexander straightened his tie and squared his shoulders. He had built an empire from the ground up, had weathered countless storms in the business world. Surely, he told himself, he could navigate this personal crisis with the same determination and skill. But as he made his way downstairs, hearing the sounds of Ethan moving about in the kitchen, Alexander felt a flutter of panic in his chest. The true test was about to begin. Could he sit across from his son, engage in their usual morning banter, all while knowing the truth? As he paused outside the kitchen door, gathering his courage, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The revelation of Ethan's sight was earth-shattering, yes, but something deep in his gut told him there were more secrets lurking beneath the surface, secrets that, once revealed, would change everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, and himself. With one final, steadying breath, Alexander pushed open the kitchen door, ready to begin the most challenging performance of his life. Little did he know the web of lies and half-truths he was about to step into was far more tangled and treacherous than he could have ever imagined. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the Blackwood Mansion's kitchen as Alexander stepped inside, his heart pounding beneath his crisp white shirt. Ethan stood at the counter, his back to the door, pouring 2 mugs with a steadiness that now seemed painfully obvious to his father. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said, turning with a smile that Alexander once found reassuring, but now saw as a mask. "I thought I heard you coming down. Coffee?" Alexander forced a smile, accepting the mug with a nod. "Thanks, son. You're up early." Ethan shrugged, his unseeing act impeccable. "Couldn't sleep. Excited about your big day, I guess. The merger, right?" "That's right," Alexander replied, studying his son's face for any sign of deception. "It's a crucial day for Blackwood Enterprises." As they settled into their usual spots at the kitchen island, Alexander found himself hyper-aware of every move Ethan made. The way he reached for the sugar bowl without hesitation, the subtle shift of his eyes as he tracked the movement of Alexander's hand, it all seemed so glaringly obvious now. You know, Dad," Ethan began, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of something more, "I've been thinking about what we discussed the other day, about me taking on a role at the company." Alexander nearly choked on his coffee. "Oh?" he managed, trying to keep his voice steady. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed somewhere over Alexander's left shoulder, a trick, Alexander now realized, that his son had perfected over years of deception. "I know it might seem unconventional given my condition, but I really think I could bring a unique perspective to the table." The irony of Ethan's words wasn't lost on Alexander. A unique perspective indeed, one born from years of secret observation and hidden abilities. He felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a wave of guilt. After all, wasn't he now keeping secrets of his own? "It's certainly something to consider," Alexander said carefully. "But let's focus on getting through today first, shall we?" "The merger is going to require all of my attention." Ethan's face fell slightly, and Alexander felt a pang of regret. Despite the lies, despite the deception, this was still his son, the boy he had raised, loved, and protected for over 2 decades. The complexity of his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. "Of course," Ethan said, recovering quickly. "I didn't mean to add to your stress. I know how important this deal is." Alexander nodded, grateful for the chance to change the subject. "It's more than just a business deal, Ethan. If this merger goes through, we'll be at the forefront of clean energy innovation. It could change the world." As he spoke, Alexander couldn't help but think of the other change looming on the horizon, the inevitable confrontation that would alter their family dynamic forever. But for now, he had to push those thoughts aside. The merger demanded his full attention. "I should get going," Alexander said, draining the last of his coffee. "Big day ahead." Ethan stood, his movements fluid and assured. "Good luck, Dad. I know you'll knock 'em dead." Alexander froze for a moment, struck by his son's choice of words. Knock 'em dead. Such a visual phrase for someone supposedly blind from childhood. Was Ethan slipping up, or was Alexander reading too much into every little thing? With a final nod to his son, Alexander left the kitchen, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. As he made his way to the garage, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving more than just his home behind. He was leaving behind a life he had thought he understood, stepping into a new reality where nothing was as it seemed. The drive to Blackwood Enterprises headquarters was a blur of city streets and internal turmoil. Alexander found himself gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead rather than the emotional minefield he had left behind. As he pulled into his reserved parking spot, Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for the day ahead. He had built this company from the ground up, navigating countless challenges along the way. Surely, he told himself, he could compartmentalize his personal crisis long enough to see this merger through. The lobby of Blackwood Enterprises was a hive of activity, buzzing with the energy of a company on the brink of a major deal. As Alexander made his way to the elevator, he was greeted by a chorus of good mornings and "Big day, Mr. Blackwood" from employees who had no idea of the turmoil roiling beneath their CEO's composed exterior. In the relative privacy of the elevator, Alexander allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes as he tried to center himself. The weight of his discovery, coupled with the pressure of the impending merger, felt like a physical presence pressing down on him. The soft ding of the elevator reaching the top floor jolted him back to reality. As the doors slid open, revealing the executive suite of Blackwood Enterprises, Alexander straightened his tie and squared his shoulders. It was time to be the leader his company needed. Personal crises be damned. His assistant, Margaret, was waiting for him as he stepped out of the elevator. A stern-faced woman in her early 60s, Margaret had been with the company almost as long as Alexander himself. Her efficiency was legendary, and her loyalty unquestionable, or so Alexander had always believed. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Margaret said, falling into step beside him as they walked towards his office. "The board is assembled in the conference room, and Mr. Hartley just called to confirm he's on his way." Alexander nodded, grateful for Margaret's steadying presence. "Thank you, Margaret. Any last-minute issues I should be aware of?" A flicker of something, hesitation, concern, crossed Margaret's face. "Nothing related to the merger, sir, but there is another matter, something that can't wait." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "What is it?" he asked, pausing outside his office door. Margaret glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "It's about the company finances, sir. I've discovered some irregularities, discrepancies that can't be explained by normal business operations." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Margaret's words sank in. Financial irregularities? On top of everything else? Alexander felt a headache building behind his eyes. "How bad?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's expression was grim. "Bad enough that if the Hartley Group gets wind of it, the merger could fall through. And that's not the worst of it." Alexander leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling every one of his 55 years. What could be worse than that? Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Alexander's with a mix of sympathy and resolve. "The trail, sir, it leads back to your father, to the early days of the company." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. His father, the man who had instilled in him the values of hard work and integrity, implicated in financial wrongdoing? It seemed impossible, and yet, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered, hadn't he just discovered that the person he thought he knew best in the world, his own son, had been living a lie for years? What other secrets might be lurking in the shadows of his life? "Sir?" Margaret's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. "What do you want to do?" Alexander straightened, his mind racing. He had mere minutes before he needed to be in the conference room, projecting confidence and control to the board and to Jonathan Hartley. He couldn't deal with this now, and yet he couldn't ignore it either. "Dig deeper," he said finally, his voice low and intense. "Find out everything you can, but keep it absolutely confidential. We'll deal with this after the merger is signed." Margaret nodded, her expression a mix of relief and concern. And if Mr. Hartley or his team start asking questions, Alexander's jaw tightened. Deflect, delay, do whatever you have to do. This merger has to go through, Margaret. The future of Blackwood Enterprises depends on it. As Margaret hurried off to do his bidding, Alexander took a moment to collect himself. He stared at his reflection in the polished surface of his office door, hardly recognizing the man who stared back. In the span of a few days, his world had been turned upside down. His son's secret, the looming confrontation, and now this, a financial scandal that threatened not just the merger, but the very legacy of Blackwood Enterprises. With a heavy heart and a mind burdened by secrets, Alexander pushed open his office door. He had exactly 2 minutes to review his notes before facing the board and Jonathan Hartley. 2 minutes to bury his personal turmoil and become the confident, charismatic leader everyone expected him to be. As he gathered his materials, a framed photo on his desk caught his eye. It showed a younger version of himself standing proudly next to his father at the opening of Blackwood Enterprises' first major production facility. They were both beaming, their arms around each other's shoulders, the picture of success and family unity. Alexander picked up the photo, studying his father's face. Had there been signs even then of the secrets that were now threatening to unravel everything, or had he been as blind to his father's deceptions as he had been to Ethan's? With a sigh, Alexander set the photo face down on his desk. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past, not when the future of his company hung in the balance. Whatever secrets lay buried in the foundation of Blackwood Enterprises, whatever lies had shaped his family's history, they would have to wait. For now, he had a merger to save and a legacy to protect. The rest, the confrontation with Ethan, the investigation into his father's actions, the reckoning that he knew was coming, would have to wait. Taking a final deep breath, Alexander strode out of his office and towards the conference room. As he pushed open the door, plastering on a smile that felt more like a grimace, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into more than just a high-stakes business meeting. He was walking into a future where every certainty he had ever known was about to be challenged, every relationship he had ever valued was about to be tested, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice whispered that this was only the beginning of the storm that was about to break over the Blackwood family. The conference room of Blackwood Enterprises hummed with nervous energy as Alexander took his place at the head of the long mahogany table. Board members shifted in their seats, papers rustled, and the quiet murmur of whispered conversations filled the air. At the far end of the table sat Jonathan Hartley, CEO of Hartley Industries, his piercing gaze fixed on Alexander. "Gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the tempest of emotions roiling within him, "today we stand on the precipice of a new era for both Blackwood Enterprises and Hartley Industries. This merger represents not just a joining of two corporate entities, but a fusion of vision, innovation, and commitment to a cleaner, more sustainable future." As he launched into his carefully prepared speech, Alexander felt a sense of déjà vu wash over him. How many times had he stood in this very room, delivering impassioned addresses to his board? How many deals had he brokered? How many crises had he navigated? And yet, never had he felt so much like an imposter as he did in this moment. Jonathan Hartley leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as Alexander spoke. "It's an impressive vision, Blackwood," he said, his tone measured. "But I have to ask, are we looking at the full picture here? Your company's financials for the past quarter seem optimistic." Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Margaret tense, her hand tightening around her pen. "I assure you, Mr. Hartley," Alexander replied smoothly, "our financials have been thoroughly vetted by our accounting team and external auditors. If there are any specific concerns you'd like to address—" "Oh, I have concerns," Hartley interrupted, a hint of steel entering his voice. "Concerns about discrepancies that my team has uncovered, discrepancies that seem to stretch back years, possibly even decades." The room fell silent, all eyes darting between Alexander and Jonathan. Alexander could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. In that moment, he realized that the carefully constructed facade of Blackwood Enterprises, and perhaps his entire life, was beginning to crumble. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Hartley," Alexander said, fighting to keep his voice level. but I can assure you that Blackwood Enterprises has always operated with the utmost integrity and transparency. Even as the words left his mouth, Alexander felt a pang of guilt. How could he speak of integrity and transparency when his own life was built on a foundation of secrets and lies? The image of Ethan, swimming confidently in the moonlit pool, flashed through his mind. Jonathan Hartley's lips curled into a humorless smile. Integrity and transparency. Interesting choice of words, Blackwood. Tell me, does that integrity extend to your family as well? To the way you've run this company since taking over from your father? Alexander felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. How much did Hartley know? How deep had his investigation gone? He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could form the words, a commotion outside the conference room caught everyone's attention. The door burst open, and to Alexander's shock and horror, Ethan strode in. Gone was the hesitant gait of a blind man. His son moved with purpose, his eyes clear and focused, scanning the room before locking onto Alexander. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice ringing out in the stunned silence. "We need to talk." "Now." The board members erupted into confused murmurs. Jonathan Hartley leaned back in his chair, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. And Alexander. Alexander felt the last vestiges of his carefully constructed world begin to disintegrate. "Ethan," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" Ethan's gaze never wavered. "Ending the lie. All of the lies. It's time for the truth to come out, Dad. About me, about the company, about everything." Alexander's mind raced. How had Ethan known to come here? How had he even gotten into the building? And most pressingly, what did he mean by everything? Before he could formulate a response, Margaret stepped forward, her face a mask of determination. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, addressing not Alexander but Ethan, "I'm afraid this isn't the time or place for—" "It's exactly the time and place," Ethan cut her off. "Because you're part of this too, aren't you, Margaret? You've known all along. About me, about Grandpa's creative accounting, about Dad's desperate attempts to keep it all hidden." The room erupted into chaos. Board members shouted questions. Jonathan Hartley demanded answers. And through it all, Alexander stood frozen, watching as the pillars of his life came crashing down around him. "Enough!" The shout came not from Alexander, but from a corner of the room where an elderly man had risen to his feet. It took Alexander a moment to recognize him. Walter Green, the oldest member of the board, and his father's closest friend. "If we're going to air dirty laundry," Walter said, his voice quavering but determined, "then let's do it properly. It's time the whole truth came out." As all eyes turned to Walter, Alexander felt a surge of dizziness. The room seemed to spin around him, faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of accusation and betrayal. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. "Alex," Walter said, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve, "there's something you need to know. Something your father should have told you years ago but couldn't bring himself to do." Alexander found himself sinking into his chair, his legs no longer able to support him. "What?" he managed to croak out. "What more could there possibly be?" Walter took a deep breath, his gaze shifting between Alexander and Ethan. "It's about Ethan's adoption, or rather, the fact that he wasn't adopted at all." The silence that fell over the conference room was deafening. Alexander's world narrowed to a pinpoint, focused solely on Walter's weathered face and the impossible words that had just left his lips. "Ethan, not adopted? How could that be?" "What are you saying, Walter?" Alexander finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Walter's eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve, met Alexander's. "Ethan is your biological son, Alex, your father. He orchestrated the whole thing. The adoption was a sham." The room erupted into chaos once more, but for Alexander, it all faded into background noise. He turned to Ethan, searching his son's face, a face he now realized bore subtle traces of his own features. Ethan stood rigid, his eyes, those eyes that could see, that had always been able to see, wide with shock. It was clear that this revelation was as new to him as it was to Alexander. "How?" Alexander choked out, returning his gaze to Walter. "Why?" Walter sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 80-plus years. "It was about 26 years ago. You had just started dating Catherine. Remember her?" Alexander nodded numbly. Catherine had been his first serious relationship after college. A whirlwind romance that had ended abruptly when she'd suddenly left town without explanation. What you didn't know, Walter continued, was that Catherine was pregnant when she left. Your father found out and, well, he saw it as a threat to the company's image. An unmarried heir with an illegitimate child, it wouldn't do. The pieces began to fall into place in Alexander's mind, a terrible picture forming. So he what, paid her off? Forced her to give up the baby? Walter nodded grimly. He arranged for the child to be placed for adoption immediately after birth. But then he had second thoughts. He realized that a grandchild, even one born out of wedlock, could be an asset, a way to ensure the Blackwood legacy continued. So he adopted his own grandson, Alexander said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, and made us both believe, that I was just some random orphan you took pity on, Ethan finished, his voice tight with emotion. Unbelievable. Jonathan Hartley, who had been watching the scene unfold with rapt attention, finally spoke up. As fascinating as this family drama is, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, I believe we were discussing some rather serious financial discrepancies. His words snapped Alexander back to the present moment, to the reality of the boardroom and the merger hanging by a thread. He looked around at the stunned faces of his board members, at Margaret's pale visage, at Ethan's clenched fists. Mr. Hartley, Alexander began, struggling to find the right words. I'm afraid I'll have to ask for a brief recess. As you can see, there are some personal matters that require immediate attention. Hartley's eyes narrowed. Personal matters that seem intimately entwined with the company's operations, from what I'm gathering. I think I speak for everyone when I say we need answers, Blackwood, about everything. Alexander felt the weight of 2 decades of lies and secrets pressing down on him. He looked at Ethan, seeing not just his son but a reflection of his younger self, angry, confused, betrayed. You're right, Alexander said finally, addressing not just Hartley but everyone in the room. You all deserve answers, and you'll get them. But first, he turned to Ethan, his heart aching. First, I need to talk to my son, my real son. Without waiting for a response, Alexander stood and walked towards Ethan. For a moment, he thought Ethan might pull away, might reject him outright. But then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan nodded. As father and son left the boardroom, the whispers erupted behind them. Alexander could feel the weight of stares on his back, could almost hear the furious tapping of fingers on smartphones as the news began to spread. They walked in silence down the hallway, past curious employees who quickly averted their gazes. Alexander led them to his private office, closing the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo with finality. Inside, Ethan immediately moved to the window, staring out at the city skyline. Alexander watched him, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. The straight spine, the confident posture, all signs of a young man who had been hiding his true self for far too long. How long have you known? Alexander asked quietly. About your sight, I mean. Ethan's shoulders tensed. I never completely lost it, he admitted, still facing the window. The doctors said the damage from the incident might not be permanent, that with time and therapy I might regain some vision. Alexander felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. Why didn't you tell me? Why keep up the charade for so long? Ethan turned then, his eyes, so like Alexander's own, filled with a storm of emotions. At first it was because I was angry at you for the accident, for not watching me closely enough, but then, he paused, swallowing hard. Then it became about protection. Protection? Alexander echoed, confused. Ethan nodded. I overheard you one night talking to Mum. You were so racked with guilt, so determined to make things right. I thought if you knew I could see, you'd leave. That you'd think your job was done. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. All these years he'd thought he was protecting Ethan, when in reality, Ethan had been the one trying to protect him. Oh, Ethan, Alexander breathed, taking a step towards his son. I love you, you're my son, nothing could ever change that. A bitter laugh escaped Ethan's lips. Your son, right. Turns out that's truer than either of us knew, huh? The reminder of Walter's revelation hung heavy between them. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of years of deception pressing down on him. I swear to you, Ethan, I had no idea, he said earnestly. If I had known... What? Ethan challenged. What would you have done differently? Would you have told me the truth about my site? About the company's finances? About anything? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. The truth was, he didn't know what he would have done. He'd spent so long living in a world of half-truths and carefully maintained facades that the idea of pure, unvarnished honesty seemed almost foreign. Ethan shook his head, a look of disappointment crossing his features. "That's what I thought," he said quietly. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with years of unspoken truths and missed opportunities. Alexander looked at his son, truly his son in every sense of the word, and felt a deep ache in his chest. How had they come to this? "Where do we go from here?" Alexander finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned back to the window, his reflection superimposed over the city skyline. "I don't know, Dad," he said, the word Dad carrying a weight it never had before. "But I do know one thing." "What's that?" Alexander asked, dreading the answer. Ethan's eyes met his in the reflection of the glass. "No more lies, no more secrets. Whatever happens next, it happens in the light." As Ethan's words hung in the air, Alexander felt something shift within him. The burden of secrets he'd carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a terrifying but exhilarating sense of possibility. "Okay," he said, squaring his shoulders. "No more lies. No more secrets." He moved to stand beside Ethan at the window, father and son side by side, their reflections merging with the city beyond. "We face whatever comes next, together, as a family." Ethan nodded, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "As a family," he echoed. For a moment they stood in silence, looking out at the world that suddenly seemed so much larger and more complex than it had just hours before. Then, with a shared nod of understanding, they turned back towards the door. It was time to face the music, time to confront the board, deal with Jonathan Hartley, and begin the long, painful process of unraveling decades of deception. But as Alexander reached for the door handle, he felt a sense of strength he hadn't experienced in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever consequences they might face, they would face them together. No more shadows, no more lies. It was time for the truth to finally fully come to light. As they stepped back into the hallway, Alexander couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a turning point for their family. It was a new beginning for Blackwood Enterprises, for their legacy and for themselves. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt ready to face it head-on. With Ethan by his side, his true son in every sense, Alexander walked back towards the boardroom, ready to confront the past and forge a new future, one built on honesty, transparency, and the unbreakable bond between father and son. The boardroom fell silent as Alexander and Ethan re-entered, the tension palpable in the air. Jonathan Hartley sat at the far end of the table, his fingers steepled in front of him, a look of calculated interest on his face. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while Margaret stood rigidly in the corner, her usually impassive face etched with worry. Alexander took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as he faced the room. Ethan stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, a united front against the storm that was about to break. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I owe you all an explanation. And more than that, I owe you the truth. The whole truth, no matter how difficult or damaging it might be." He paused, looking around the room, meeting each person's gaze. These were people who had trusted him, who had built their careers on the foundation of Blackwood Enterprises. They deserved nothing less than complete honesty. "For years," Alexander continued, "I've prided myself on running this company with integrity and transparency. I've demanded the highest ethical standards from each and every one of you. But the truth is, I've been living a lie. We've all been living a lie." A murmur went through the room, but Alexander pressed on. "It started long before my time, with my father. The financial irregularities that Mr. Hartley's team uncovered, they're real. My father used the company as a front for questionable financial practices. Practices that continued under my leadership, though I swear to you I was unaware of their full extent until recently." Jonathan Hartley leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Are you admitting to fraud, Mr. Blackwood?" Alexander met his gaze squarely. "I'm admitting to negligence, Mr. Hartley, to turning a blind eye to things I should have investigated more thoroughly. And yes, if the full audit reveals what I fear it might, there may be instances of fraud that occurred under my watch. The room erupted into chaos, board members shouting questions and demanding explanations. Alexander held up his hands, calling for silence. "Please," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "Let me finish. There's more you need to know." As the room quieted, Alexander turned to Ethan, receiving a small nod of encouragement. "Many of you have met my son, Ethan. What you don't know, what I didn't know until today, is that Ethan is not adopted. He's my biological son, hidden from me by my father in an attempt to protect the company's image." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Ethan stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. "It's true. I only learned of this myself today, but there's more." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm not blind. I haven't been for years. I've been pretending, out of a misguided attempt to protect my father, to protect all of you, really." The revelation seemed to stun the room into silence. Alexander watched as the board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to anger. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "If we're laying all our cards on the table," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "then there's something else you should know." She turned to Alexander, apology written across her features. "I've known about the financial irregularities for years. Your father, he made me complicit. I stayed silent to protect the company, to protect you. I thought I was doing the right thing, but..." Alexander felt as if the floor was shifting beneath his feet. Margaret, his trusted right hand for decades, had known all along? He opened his mouth to respond, but Jonathan Hartley beat him to it. "Well," Hartley said, his tone caught between amusement and disgust, "this is certainly more than I bargained for when I came here to discuss a merger. I think it's safe to say that deal is off the table." Alexander nodded, a strange sense of relief washing over him, despite the dire circumstances. "I understand, Mr. Hartley, and I apologize for wasting your time." Hartley stood, buttoning his jacket. "Oh, I wouldn't say it was a waste. Enlightening, perhaps. Disturbing, certainly." He paused at the door, turning back to face Alexander. "For what it's worth, Blackwood, I respect your honesty today. It couldn't have been easy. But make no mistake, this isn't over. My legal team will be in touch." As Hartley left, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Alexander looked around at the shell-shocked faces of his board members, at Margaret's slumped shoulders, at Ethan's tense but supportive presence beside him. "I know you all have questions," Alexander said, his voice heavy with the weight of his confessions. "And you deserve answers. But before we go any further, I want you to know that I take full responsibility for what's happened here. Whatever consequences come, I'll face them. But I promise you this, from this moment forward, Blackwood Enterprises will operate with true transparency and integrity, no matter the cost." One of the board members, a woman named Diane, who had been with the company almost as long as Alexander, spoke up. "And how exactly do you propose to do that, Alex? The company's reputation will be in tatters once this gets out. And it will get out." Alexander nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "You're right, Diane. Our reputation will suffer. We may face legal consequences, financial penalties, but I believe we have an opportunity here, an opportunity to become the company we've always claimed to be." He moved to the head of the table, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. "I'm proposing a complete overhaul. Full disclosure of our financial history, cooperation with any investigations, a restructuring of our leadership, including my own role." A ripple of surprise went through the room at his last words. Alexander pressed on. "I'm prepared to step down as CEO if that's what the board decides is best for the company. But regardless of my position, I intend to use every resource at my disposal to make this right." Ethan stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with his father. "And I want to help," he said, his voice firm. "I've spent years hiding who I really am, but I have skills and knowledge that could be valuable to the company. If you'll have me, I want to be part of rebuilding Blackwood Enterprises into something we can all be proud of." The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances, processing the monumental revelations and proposals laid before them. Alexander could almost see the wheels turning in their minds, weighing the risks and potential rewards of the path he was suggesting. Finally, Walter Green, the elder statesman of the board, cleared his throat. "Alex, Ethan," he began, his voice gravelly with age and emotion. "What you're proposing is unprecedented. It's risky, it's potentially ruinous, and it's—" He paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's exactly what this company needs." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Diane spoke up again, her tone cautious but not unkind. "It won't be easy. We'll be under intense scrutiny." The days following the explosive board meeting passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alexander, true to his word, had initiated a full-scale audit of Blackwood Enterprises, bringing in an independent team of forensic accountants to comb through decades of financial records. The company's legal team worked around the clock, preparing for the inevitable investigations and potential lawsuits. Ethan, meanwhile, had thrown himself into the task of learning every aspect of the business. His years of secret observation had given him a unique perspective, and his sharp mind quickly grasped the intricacies of corporate finance and operations. The board, initially skeptical, was gradually warming to his presence and ideas. It was a crisp autumn morning when Alexander found himself standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows in his office, looking out over the city he had once felt he owned. Now that sense of invincibility was gone, replaced by a humbling awareness of his own fallibility. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. "Come in," he called, turning to see Ethan enter, a stack of papers tucked under his arm. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said, the words still carrying a weight of newfound meaning. "I've been going over the preliminary audit reports. It's not good." Alexander nodded, gesturing for Ethan to take a seat. "I expected as much." "How bad are we talking?" Ethan spread the papers out on the desk, his face grave. "The irregularities go back further than we thought. Grandpa was cooking the books from the very beginning, and the environmental impact reports for our older facilities, they were falsified. We're looking at potential criminal charges, not to mention massive fines and civil suits." Alexander felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He had known it would be bad, but this was potentially company-ending. "What are our options?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Alexander's own that it momentarily took his breath away. "Legally, we're in trouble, but I've been thinking, what if we get ahead of this? What if we don't just come clean, but we use this as an opportunity to completely reinvent Blackwood Enterprises?" Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite the dire circumstances. "Go on." "We pivot," Ethan said, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "We take every dirty secret, every environmental violation, every cooked book, and we lay it all out. But we don't just apologize, we commit to fixing it, all of it. We pour our resources into cleaning up our old facilities, into developing truly green technologies. We become the watchdog of the industry, setting a new standard for corporate responsibility." As Ethan spoke, Alexander felt a glimmer of hope kindle in his chest. It was audacious, potentially ruinous, and exactly the kind of bold move that had built Blackwood Enterprises in the first place. "It won't be easy," Alexander warned. "We'll face enormous resistance, not just from outside the company, but from within. There are a lot of people who've benefited from the old way of doing things." Ethan nodded, his expression determined. "I know, but Dad, this is our chance to make things right, to build something we can actually be proud of." Alexander studied his son's face, seeing in it a reflection of his own younger self, idealistic, driven, unafraid to take risks. But there was something else there too, a wisdom and compassion that Alexander realized, with a pang of regret, he had somehow lost along the way. "All right," Alexander said finally. "Let's do it. But if we're going to do this, we do it all the way. No half measures, no holding back. We lay it all out there and let the chips fall where they may." Ethan's face broke into a grin, the first real smile Alexander had seen from him in weeks. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already started drafting a proposal for the board, and I think I know just the person to help us sell it." Before Alexander could ask who Ethan had in mind, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Margaret who entered, her face lined with worry but her posture as straight and dignified as ever. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, then paused, correcting herself. "Alexander, the FBI is here. They're asking to speak with you." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine, but he squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. "Thank you, Margaret. Please show them in." As Margaret turned to leave, Alexander called out to her, "And Margaret, thank you for everything. I know you were trying to protect us all these years. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that I appreciate your loyalty." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. As she left to escort the FBI agents to the office, Alexander turned back to Ethan. "Well, son," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, "it looks like our redemption story is about to begin a little sooner than we planned. Are you ready for this?" Ethan stood, moving to stand beside his father. "Ready as I'll ever be. We're in this together, right?" Alexander placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling a surge of pride and love for the man his son had become. "Together," he affirmed. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway, Alexander and Ethan Blackwood stood side by side, ready to face the consequences of the past and fight for the future of their company and their family. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with legal battles, public scrutiny, and the monumental task of rebuilding trust. But for the first time in years, Alexander felt a sense of purpose that went beyond profit margins and stock prices. They were no longer just fighting to save a company. They were fighting for redemption, for the chance to leave a legacy they could be proud of. And as the office door opened to reveal the stern faces of the FBI agents, Alexander knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. The real work, the hard work of rebuilding, of making amends, of earning back trust, was only just beginning. But with Ethan by his side and a newfound commitment to transparency and integrity, Alexander felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he stepped forward to greet the agents, Alexander Blackwood made a silent vow. No matter what it took, no matter how long it took, he would make things right. For his company, for his employees, for his son, and for himself. The era of secrets and lies was over. The path to redemption had begun. The following weeks were a blur of interrogations, legal meetings, and late nights poring over financial records. Alexander and Ethan had barely left the office, working tirelessly to cooperate with the FBI investigation, while simultaneously trying to keep Blackwood Enterprises afloat. The media frenzy was relentless. News vans camped outside the company headquarters, reporters hounding employees for any scrap of information. Alexander's face was plastered across every newspaper and news channel, usually accompanied by unflattering headlines about corporate greed and family deception. Finally, they reached a makeshift podium that had been set up near the plant gates. The union leader, a burly man named Frank, whom Alexander had known for years, stood waiting for them, his expression a mix of anger and wary respect. "Mr. Blackwood," Frank said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "You've got some explaining to do." Alexander nodded, stepping up to the microphone. The crowd quieted, a tense silence falling over the gathering. "I know you're angry," Alexander began, his voice steady. "You have every right to be. The changes we're implementing are difficult, disruptive. They're asking a lot of you, and you're worried about your futures." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Alexander pressed on. "But I'm here to tell you that your futures, our future together, depends on making these changes. The old way of doing things, it wasn't sustainable. It was killing our planet, and eventually, it would have killed this company too." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. Some were skeptical, others openly hostile, but he could see a few nodding in reluctant agreement. "I know you've heard a lot of corporate doublespeak over the years, a lot of promises that turned out to be empty. So I'm not going to stand here and make more promises. Instead, I'm going to offer you a partnership." The word hung in the air, and Alexander could feel the shift in the crowd's energy. He gestured for Ethan to join him at the microphone. "This is my son, Ethan. Many of you know him, or know of him. What you might not know is that Ethan is now my co-CEO, and together we're proposing something unprecedented." Ethan stepped forward, his voice clear and confident as he addressed the crowd. "We want to form a worker management council. Equal representation from the shop floor and the boardroom. This council will have real power, the ability to shape policy, to ensure that as we move forward with our environmental initiatives, we're also protecting jobs and creating new opportunities." A buzz of conversation swept through the crowd. Alexander could see Frank, the union leader, leaning in to consult with his colleagues. "We're not asking for blind trust," Alexander continued. "We're asking for a chance to prove through actions, not words, that we're committed to building a company that's not just profitable, but ethical. A company that values its workers as much as its bottom line." He took a deep breath, preparing for his final appeal. "I know we've let you down in the past. I know we've got a long way to go to earn back your trust, but I'm standing here today, asking you to take this journey with us, to be part of building something we can all be proud of." As Alexander finished speaking, a hush fell over the crowd. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, judging, considering. The next few moments would be crucial. Would they buy into this new vision or reject it as just another corporate ploy? Frank stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You're asking for a lot, Blackwood. Trust doesn't come easy these days." Alexander nodded, acknowledging the truth of Frank's words. "I know, that's why we're here in person. That's why we're offering real power sharing, not just lip service." Frank studied him for a long moment, then turned to the crowd. "What do you say, folks? Do we give them a chance to put their money where their mouth is?" The response was mixed, shouts of approval mingling with skeptical grumbling. But slowly, a chant began to build. "Vote! Vote! Vote!" Frank turned back to Alexander and Ethan, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "Looks like you've bought yourselves some time. We'll take this proposal to a vote. But let me be clear, if this turns out to be just another corporate con job, you'll have a much bigger problem on your hands than a strike." As Frank moved to address the crowd, organizing the voting process, Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was a chance, an opportunity to prove that their commitment to change was real. Ethan leaned in, his voice low. "That was close. For a minute there, I thought we were going to have a riot on our hands." Alexander nodded, the tension of the moment still thrumming through his veins. "We're not out of the woods yet, but it's a start." As they watched the workers begin to disperse, preparing for the vote, Alexander couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in months, he felt like they were making real progress. The Blackwood legacy was being rewritten, one difficult conversation at a time. And as he stood there with Ethan, facing the uncertain future together, Alexander knew that whatever came next, they were on the right path. The path of transparency, accountability, and genuine partnership with the people who had always been the true heart of Blackwood Enterprises. As the private jet carrying Alexander and Ethan Blackwood touched down in their hometown, the weight of the past seemed to press down on them both. They had come to address the local community, to face the people who had known the Blackwood family for generations, and to confront the legacy of environmental damage their company had left behind. The small airport was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the tumultuous scene they had left behind at the Millbrook plant. As they descended the steps of the jet, Alexander caught sight of a familiar face waiting by the terminal building. It was Sarah Jennings, his childhood friend and now the mayor of their hometown. "Alex," Sarah greeted them, her tone a mix of warmth and wariness. "It's been a long time." Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of the years between them. "Too long, Sarah. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Sarah's gaze shifted to Ethan, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "And this must be Ethan. My, you've grown up." Ethan stepped forward, shaking Sarah's hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mayor Jennings. I've heard a lot about you from my father." As they made their way to the waiting car, Alexander could feel the tension radiating from Sarah. He knew this visit wasn't just about confronting the past. It was about charting a course for the future, one that would have profound implications for the town that had been home to Blackwood Enterprises for over half a century. The drive into town was a journey through memories for Alexander. Every street corner, every storefront seemed to hold echoes of his youth, but as they approached the town center, the mood shifted. Alexander couldn't help but notice the subtle signs of economic struggle: closed shops, faded paintwork, a general air of neglect that hadn't been there in his childhood. "It's been tough," Sarah said, noticing his gaze. "When the old Blackwood plant downsized, it hit us hard. A lot of families left looking for work elsewhere." Alexander felt a pang of guilt. The decision to downsize the local plant had been made years ago, driven by profit margins and efficiency reports. He had approved it without much thought to the human cost. Now seeing the impact firsthand, he realized how short-sighted that decision had been. They pulled up in front of the town hall, where a crowd had already gathered. Alexander recognized many faces, former classmates, neighbors, people who had worked for Blackwood Enterprises for decades. Some looked curious, others angry, but all wore expressions of grim determination. As they stepped out of the car, a hush fell over the crowd. Alexander straightened his shoulders, preparing to face the consequences of years of corporate decisions that had prioritized profit over people and the environment. Sarah led them to a podium set up on the town hall steps. "Good luck," she murmured, stepping aside to let Alexander take the microphone. For a moment, Alexander hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then he felt Ethan's hand on his shoulder, a gesture of support that gave him the strength to begin. "Good afternoon," he started, his voice carrying across the square. "I know many of you are wondering why I'm here today. Why, after years of absence, I've chosen to return to the town where Blackwood Enterprises began." He paused, looking out over the sea of familiar faces. "The truth is, I'm here to apologize, to take responsibility for the damage that our company, my family's company, has done to this community and to the environment we all share." A murmur ran through the crowd. Alexander pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "For too long, we operated with a singular focus on profit, ignoring the true cost of our actions. We polluted your water, we decimated your forests, and when it no longer served our bottom line, we abandoned you." The murmur grew louder, angry shouts beginning to rise from the crowd. Alexander held up his hand, asking for silence. "I know that words are not enough. That's why I'm here today, not just to apologize, but to make a commitment to make things right." He gestured for Ethan to join him at the podium. "This is my son, Ethan. Together, we're implementing a complete overhaul of Blackwood Enterprises. We're not just cleaning up our act, we're dedicating ourselves to reversing the damage we've done." Ethan stepped forward, his voice clear and passionate as he addressed the crowd. "We're proposing a comprehensive environmental restoration project right here in this town. We want to clean up the old factory site, replant the forests, and work with local experts to restore the watershed." A buzz of conversation swept through the gathering. Alexander could see a mix of emotions on the faces before him: skepticism, hope, anger, curiosity. "But more than that," Alexander continued, "we want to bring jobs back to this community, real, sustainable jobs. We're proposing to build a new research and development center here, focused on green technologies. We want to partner with local schools and colleges to create training programs to ensure that the jobs of the future are filled by the people of this community." He took a deep breath, preparing for his final appeal. "I know we've lost your trust. I know that for many of you, the Blackwood name has become synonymous with corporate greed and environmental destruction. We're not asking you to forgive and forget. We're asking for a chance to make amends, to be part of building a better future for this town and for the planet." As Alexander finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the square. He could feel the weight of judgment in the eyes of his former neighbors and friends. Would they believe in the sincerity of his words? Would they be willing to give Blackwood Enterprises, to give him another chance? Suddenly, a voice called out from the crowd. "How do we know this isn't just another corporate PR stunt? Why should we trust you now?" Alexander recognized the speaker, Tom Henderson, his old high school rival, now a prominent local businessman. He nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. "You're right to be skeptical, Tom. We've given you every reason to distrust us. That's why we're not asking for blind faith. We're proposing a community oversight board with real power. This board will have access to all our records, all our plans. They'll have the authority to halt any project that doesn't meet the strictest environmental and ethical standards." Another voice piped up, this time from an elderly woman Alexander recognized as his former neighbor. "And what about the people who lost their jobs when you closed the old plant? What about their families?" Ethan stepped forward to answer this one. "We've set aside a fund for restitution. Anyone who lost their job due to the plant closure will be offered either re-employment in our new facilities or compensation and job training. We can't undo the past, but we can try to make it right." As the questions continued, Alexander could feel a shift in the energy of the crowd. The initial hostility was giving way to cautious interest. People were engaging, asking tough but fair questions about timelines, budgets, and specifics of the proposed projects. The weeks following the town hall meeting were a whirlwind of activity for Alexander and Ethan Blackwood. They had set up temporary offices in their hometown, working tirelessly to turn their ambitious promises into concrete plans. The Community Oversight Board had been established, and its members, a diverse group of local leaders, environmental experts, and former Blackwood employees, were proving to be both challenging and invaluable partners. On a crisp autumn morning, Alexander found himself walking through the overgrown grounds of the old Blackwood plant. The rusted gates, the crumbling facades, the weed-choked parking lots, all stood as stark reminders of the company's past sins. But today, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Ethan jogged up to join him, a tablet in hand and excitement in his eyes. "Dad, the environmental assessment team just sent over their final report. It's not as bad as we feared. The soil contamination is manageable, and the groundwater, well, it'll take time, but it's not beyond repair." Alexander nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "That's good news. What about the structural assessment?" "Mixed bag," Ethan replied, swiping through documents on his tablet. "The main production floor is sound enough to be repurposed, but the east wing will need to be demolished. Silver lining, though. It gives us a clean slate to design a state-of-the-art research facility." As they walked, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at his son's enthusiasm and competence. Ethan had thrown himself into this project with a passion that went beyond mere corporate responsibility. This was personal for him, a chance to redefine the Blackwood legacy. Their tour was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Jennings, the town mayor. Her expression was guarded but not unfriendly as she approached. "Gentlemen," she greeted them, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Alexander shook his head. "Not at all, Sarah. In fact, your timing is perfect. We were just discussing the latest assessments. Things are looking promising." Sarah's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Promising? That's not the word most people in town would use to describe this place." Ethan stepped forward, his face earnest. "We know it looks bad now, Mayor Jennings, but we have a vision for what this place could become. Not just a cleaned-up version of the old plant, but a completely new kind of facility. One that creates jobs, yes, but also contributes positively to the community and the environment." He handed her the tablet, walking her through the preliminary designs. Alexander watched as Sarah's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. "It's ambitious," she admitted finally. "But how can you guarantee that history won't repeat itself? That in a few years, when profits dip or shareholders get antsy, you won't just pack up and leave again?" It was a fair question, and one Alexander had been grappling with himself. "We can't predict the future, Sarah," he said honestly, "but we can put safeguards in place. The Community Oversight Board isn't just for show. They'll have real power, enshrined in legally binding agreements. And we're exploring options for partial employee ownership of the new facility." Sarah's eyes widened at this last part. "Employee ownership? That's unexpected." Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "We believe it's the key to creating true, long-term alignment between the company and the community. When the people working here have a genuine stake in its success, it changes the whole dynamic." As they continued their tour, explaining their plans in more detail, Alexander could see Sarah's reservations slowly melting away. By the time they reached the proposed site for the new research center, she was actively contributing ideas. "You know," Sarah said, pausing to survey the overgrown field that would soon be transformed, "there's an old nature trail that runs along the back of this property. It used to be beautiful before we ruined it," Alexander finished quietly. Sarah nodded, a sad smile on her face. "I was thinking, if you're serious about this environmental restoration, reopening that trail could be a wonderful symbol, a way to give something back to the community that's not just about jobs and money." Ethan's face lit up. "That's a brilliant idea. We could even extend it, create an educational nature walk that showcases the restoration work. Imagine school groups coming here to learn about environmental recovery in real time." As Ethan began sketching out ideas on his tablet, Alexander felt a surge of emotion. This was more than just a corporate turnaround or a PR exercise. They were planting the seeds of real, lasting change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings with the environmental team, with local contractors, with members of the Community Oversight Board. By the time evening fell, Alexander was exhausted but exhilarated. He found himself standing alone at the edge of the property, watching the sun set over the hills that had been the backdrop of his childhood. The sight stirred memories of his father, of the early days of Blackwood Enterprises, of the pride he had once felt in the family business. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ethan's voice broke through his reverie. Alexander turned to his son, a wistful smile on his face. "Just thinking about your grandfather, about how proud he was of this place once upon a time." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think he'd approve of what we're doing now?" It was a complex question, one that Alexander had been avoiding. His father had been a man of his time, focused on growth, on profits, on building something that would last. The idea of prioritizing environmental concerns or community welfare over the bottom line would have been foreign to him. "Honestly, I'm not sure," Alexander admitted. "Your grandfather, he had a different vision of success. But I'd like to think that if he could see the bigger picture, if he could understand the challenges we're facing now, he might come around." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the fading light on the horizon. "You know, for years I resented him. Resented both of you, really. I thought the family legacy was nothing but lies and greed." Alexander felt a pang of guilt, but before he could respond, Ethan continued. "But now I think maybe the legacy isn't set in stone. Maybe we get to define it, to shape it into something we can be proud of." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, father and son stood in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts of the past and dreams of the future. The path ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt a sense of true purpose. They were no longer just trying to save a company or rehabilitate a tarnished name. They were building something new, something that could make a real difference. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Alexander allowed himself to hope that this moment, this project, this new vision might be the true legacy of the Blackwood name. The transformation of the old Blackwood plant was well underway, and the once derelict site now buzzed with activity. Crews worked tirelessly to remediate the soil, while architects and engineers collaborated on the designs for the new research facility. The change wasn't just physical. There was a palpable shift in the town's energy, a cautious optimism that grew stronger with each passing day. Alexander Blackwood stood at the edge of the construction site, watching as a group of local high school students toured the area. It was part of a new initiative, engaging the community's youth in the restoration process, teaching them about environmental science and sustainable technology. Ethan was leading the tour, his enthusiasm infectious as he explained the intricacies of bioremediation to the wide-eyed teenagers. "Quite a change from the old days, isn't it?" a familiar voice said from behind him. Alexander turned to see Frank, the union leader from the Millbrook plant, watching the scene with a mix of wonder and wariness. "Frank," Alexander greeted him, extending his hand. "I'm glad you could make it. What do you think?" Frank shook his hand, his grip firm. "It's impressive, I'll give you that. But I've got to ask, how's this playing with your shareholders? Last I heard, they weren't too thrilled with the direction you're taking." Alexander nodded, acknowledging the challenge. The past few months had seen intense debates in the boardroom, with some shareholders pushing for a more traditional approach to recovery. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted. "We've lost some investors who were looking for quick profits, but we've also gained new ones, people who believe in what we're trying to do here." As they walked along the perimeter of the site, Alexander pointed out the areas designated for the new research labs, the education center, and the restored nature trail. Frank listened intently, his skepticism slowly giving way to genuine interest. "You know," Frank said as they paused to watch a team of workers planting native species along the trail, "when you first came to Millbrook with all this talk of a new Blackwood Enterprises, I thought it was just another corporate snow job. But this," he gestured at the bustling site, "this is real." Alexander felt a surge of pride, not just in the physical progress, but in the changes they were making in people's perceptions. "It is real, Frank, and it's just the beginning. We're implementing similar programs at all our sites, tailored to each community's needs." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Jennings, accompanied by a group of people Alexander didn't recognize. Sarah's face was alight with excitement as she approached. "Alex, I'm glad I caught you," she said. "There are some people I'd like you to meet. They're from Oak Ridge, the next town over. They've been following what we're doing here and, well, I'll let them tell you." A middle-aged woman stepped forward, introducing herself as the mayor of Oak Ridge. "Mr. Blackwood, we've been watching your work here with great interest. Our town has been struggling since the closure of the textile mill a few years back. We were wondering if Blackwood Enterprises might consider expanding your initiatives to our community." Alexander was taken aback. He looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly, then at Frank, who seemed equally surprised but intrigued. We'd certainly be open to discussing it," Alexander said carefully. "But I want to be clear. What we're doing here isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It requires a real partnership with the community, a commitment to long-term change." The Oak Ridge mayor nodded eagerly. "Of course. We're prepared to do whatever it takes. Your approach, combining environmental restoration with job creation and community engagement, it's exactly what we need." As the group from Oak Ridge began to share their town's story, Alexander felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Ethan, who had finished his tour and joined them. "What's going on?" Ethan asked quietly. Alexander quickly brought him up to speed. Ethan's eyes widened, his mind clearly racing with possibilities. "Dad, do you realize what this could mean? If we could replicate what we're doing here in other communities, it could change everything," Alexander finished, the magnitude of the opportunity dawning on him. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of discussions and impromptu planning sessions. As word spread that representatives from Oak Ridge were on site, more local officials arrived, eager to be part of the conversation. By evening, what had started as a casual inquiry had evolved into the framework for a multi-community revitalization initiative. As the sun began to set, Alexander found a quiet moment to slip away. He made his way to a small hill overlooking the construction site, needing a moment to process the day's events. The view from the hilltop was breathtaking. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the site, highlighting the progress they'd made. Where once there had been only decay and contamination, now there were signs of new life everywhere, from the newly planted trees to the foundations of the research facility rising from the ground. But it was more than just the physical transformation that moved Alexander. It was the energy, the sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from every person on the site. Workers, community members, students, all were part of something larger than themselves, part of a vision for a better future. "It's something, isn't it?" Ethan's voice broke through his thoughts. His son joined him on the hilltop, his face flushed with excitement from the day's events. Alexander nodded, unable to find words to express the mix of emotions he was feeling. Pride, hope, a touch of fear at the enormity of what they were undertaking. It all swirled within him. "You know," Ethan continued, his voice thoughtful, "when we started this, I thought it was about saving the company, about making amends for past mistakes, but it's become so much more than that." Alexander turned to his son, struck by the wisdom and passion in his eyes. "You're right. We're not just changing Blackwood Enterprises. We're changing the very idea of what a corporation can be, what it should be." As they stood there, watching the last light fade from the sky, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still long and undoubtedly filled with challenges. Expanding their initiative to other communities would require resources, careful planning, and an unwavering commitment to their new values. But for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, Alexander felt truly aligned with his work. This wasn't about profits or power, or living up to some inherited notion of success. This was about making a real, tangible difference in the world. "Dad," Ethan said softly, "do you think we can really do this? Change not just our company, but maybe change the way business is done." Alexander put his arm around his son's shoulders, feeling a surge of love and pride. "I don't know, son, but I do know this. It's a fight worth having, and whatever happens, we're in it together." As they made their way back down the hill, towards the group still deep in discussion about the future, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Blackwood legacy was being rewritten, not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the renewed hope of communities, in the restoration of damaged ecosystems, in the bright eyes of students learning about a sustainable future. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, doubters, and challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But as he looked at Ethan, at the transformed site before them, at the engaged faces of community members and workers alike, Alexander knew one thing for certain. This was more than redemption. This was revolution, and it was only the beginning. The autumn chill had given way to the first biting winds of winter as Alexander Blackwood made his way through the quiet streets of his hometown. The early morning light cast long shadows, a fitting backdrop for the journey he was about to undertake. Today, he would face a part of his past he had long avoided: his mother. Eleanor Blackwood had been a distant figure for most of Alexander's life, retreating into a world of her own after the death of her husband. She lived alone in the sprawling Blackwood family mansion, tended to by a small staff who kept the curious at bay and the family secrets safely locked away. As Alexander approached the imposing gates of the estate, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had put off this visit for weeks, focusing on the whirlwind of activity surrounding the company's transformation. But the time had come to confront the last lingering shadows of his past. The elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, greeted him at the door with a tight-lipped smile. "She's in the solarium, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been expecting you." Alexander nodded his thanks and made his way through the hushed corridors of his childhood home. Family portraits lined the walls, stern faces of Blackwood patriarchs staring down at him. He paused briefly before a photograph of his father, wondering what the man would think of the path he and Ethan had chosen. The solarium was a riot of greenery and light, a stark contrast to the somber mood of the rest of the house. Eleanor Blackwood sat in a high-backed chair, her once vibrant red hair now a soft white, her piercing blue eyes fixed on the garden beyond the glass. "Mother," Alexander said softly, announcing his presence. Eleanor turned, her gaze sharpening as it fell upon her son. "Alexander, you finally decided to grace us with your presence." The words were barbed, but Alexander detected a hint of something else beneath the sarcasm: uncertainty, perhaps even fear. He took a seat across from her, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. "I'm sorry it's taken me so long to visit," he began. "Things have been complicated." Eleanor's laugh was brittle. "Complicated? Is that what you call turning your back on everything your father built? Everything this family stands for?" Alexander felt a flare of anger, but pushed it down. He hadn't come here to argue. "Mother, I need to ask you something. About Ethan." At the mention of her grandson's name, Eleanor's composure faltered. "What about him? Did you know?" Alexander asked, his voice low and intense. "Did you know that he was my biological son? That father arranged the whole adoption charade?" The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's hands, clasped tightly in her lap, began to tremble. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Of course I knew. I knew everything." The admission hit Alexander like a physical blow. "Why?" he managed. "Why keep it a secret all these years?" Eleanor's eyes flashed with a hint of her old fire. "To protect you, of course. To protect the company. Your father, he had a vision for the future of Blackwood Enterprises. A vision that didn't include scandals or illegitimate children." "And what about Ethan's mother?" Alexander pressed, a sick feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. "What happened to her?" For the first time, Eleanor looked truly shaken. "Catherine, she wanted to keep the baby. Your father, he can be very persuasive when he wants to be." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Alexander felt as though the ground was shifting beneath him, everything he thought he knew about his family, his past, crumbling away. "There's more, isn't there?" he said, dreading the answer, but knowing he needed to hear it. "About the company, about father's business practices?" Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the garden, her voice taking on a distant quality. "Your father was a visionary, Alexander. He understood that sometimes, to build something great, sacrifices had to be made. Rules had to be bent." As Eleanor spoke, painting a picture of decades of corruption, of environmental negligence, of lives ruined in the pursuit of profit, Alexander felt a cold fury building within him, not just at his father or at the company, but at the culture of secrecy and denial that had allowed it all to happen. "Enough," he said finally, cutting off his mother's justifications. "I didn't come here for excuses or rationalizations. I came for the truth." Eleanor fell silent, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment she looked old and frail, the weight of years of secrets finally taking their toll. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Alexander stood, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "I'm going to make it right, all of it. no matter what it takes. As he turned to leave, Eleanor called out, a note of desperation in her voice. "Alexander, wait. There's something else you should know. About Catherine, about why she left." But Alexander was already walking away, his mind reeling from the revelations of the day. He needed time to process, to plan his next move. As he stepped out of the mansion and into the crisp winter air, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Ethan, we need to talk. There's something you need to know about your mother." As he hung up, Alexander looked back at the Blackwood mansion, its windows dark and forbidding. He had come seeking answers but had left with even more questions. The shadows of the past were long indeed, but he was determined to bring them into the light, no matter the cost. The journey back to town was a blur, Alexander's mind racing with the implications of what he had learned. The transformation of Blackwood Enterprises wasn't just about righting recent wrongs, it was about unraveling decades of deception and corruption. The task ahead seemed more daunting than ever, but also more vital. As he approached the construction site of the new Blackwood facility, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten, and he was determined to ensure that the next chapter of the Blackwood legacy would be one of transparency, responsibility, and genuine positive impact. The sound of hammering and the buzz of activity grew louder as he neared the site. In the midst of it all, he spotted Ethan, deep in conversation with a group of environmental engineers. The sight of his son, earnest, passionate, untainted by the sins of the past, gave Alexander hope. There were difficult conversations ahead, truths that would be painful to reveal. But as he watched Ethan, saw the respect and admiration in the eyes of those around him, Alexander knew that they were on the right path. The Blackwood name would mean something different to future generations, not a symbol of greed and corruption, but of redemption and positive change. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the bustling construction site of the new Blackwood facility. Alexander stood at the edge of the property, his breath visible in the cold air as he waited for Ethan to arrive. The weight of the revelations from his visit to his mother pressed heavily upon him, each passing moment making the impending conversation with his son feel more daunting. He spotted Ethan's approaching figure in the distance, his son's stride purposeful and quick. As Ethan drew nearer, Alexander could see the concern etched on his face. "Dad," Ethan called out as he reached him, slightly out of breath. "What's going on? Your message sounded urgent." Alexander took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you." "About your mother?" Ethan's eyes widened, a mix of emotions flashing across his face: hope, fear, anticipation. "My birth mother? What about her?" Alexander gestured towards a quiet corner of the site, away from the noise and activity. As they walked, he began to recount his conversation with Eleanor, watching Ethan's reactions carefully. "So, she didn't abandon me willingly?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted to keep me." Alexander nodded, feeling a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. "It seems your grandfather, my father, he pressured her to give you up, to protect the company's image, to protect me." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. "And you never knew? All these years?" "I swear to you, Ethan, I had no idea," Alexander said earnestly. "If I had known—" "What?" Ethan interrupted, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "What would you have done? Would you have gone against your father? Against the almighty Blackwood legacy?" The words stung, but Alexander knew they were fair. "I'd like to think I would have," he said softly. "But the truth is, I don't know. I was a different person then. But Ethan, what matters now is what we do with this information." Ethan turned away, his gaze sweeping across the construction site, the physical manifestation of their efforts to right the wrongs of the past. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Do you think she's still out there? My mother?" Alexander felt a glimmer of hope at the question. "I don't know, but we can find out. If you want to, that is." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he nodded. "I think I do. I need to know the whole truth, not just for myself, but for all of us. No more secrets, remember?" Alexander smiled sadly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "No more secrets," he agreed, As they stood there, the sounds of construction providing a steady backdrop to their conversation, Alexander felt a shift in the air between them. The revelation, painful as it was, had opened up a new level of honesty in their relationship. "There's more," Alexander said quietly. "About the company, about your grandfather's business practices. It's worse than we thought." Over the next hour, as the winter sun sank lower in the sky, Alexander shared everything he had learned from Eleanor. The decades of corruption, the environmental negligence, the lives affected by the Blackwood pursuit of profit at any cost. Ethan listened intently, his expression growing more determined with each revelation. "We have to make this right," Ethan said, as Alexander finished. "All of it. Not just the recent stuff, but all of it." Alexander nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and trepidation at his son's resolve. "It won't be easy. The more we dig, the more skeletons we're likely to find. And there will be people who want to keep the past buried." Ethan's eyes flashed with a familiar determination, a look Alexander recognized from his own younger days. "Let them try to stop us. We've come too far to back down now." As they made their way back towards the heart of the construction site, Alexander and Ethan began to formulate a plan. They would need to expand their investigation, to reach out to those who might have been affected by Blackwood's past misdeeds. It would mean opening old wounds, facing harsh truths, and possibly putting the entire future of the company at risk. But as they walked among the partially constructed buildings, watching workers and community members working side by side to build something new, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about saving a company or clearing a family name. It was about fundamental change, about setting right decades of wrongs. "You know," Ethan said, pausing to watch a group of local students touring the eco-friendly water treatment facility, "when we started this, I thought it was just about turning the company around. But it's become something so much bigger, hasn't it?" Alexander nodded, feeling a swell of pride in his son's insight. "It has. We're not just changing Blackwood Enterprises. We're challenging the very idea of what a corporation can be, what it should be responsible for." As the day's work wound down and the site began to empty, Alexander and Ethan found themselves standing at the spot where the old Blackwood plant's main gate had once stood. The rusted remnants had been cleared away, replaced by an open space that would soon become a community garden. "Whatever happens next," Ethan said, his voice firm with resolve, "we face it together. As a family." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat at his son's words. Despite everything, the lies, the secrets, the years of deception, they had found their way to this moment. A moment of truth, of commitment to a shared vision of a better future. "Together," Alexander agreed, clasping his son's shoulder. As they turned to leave, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them, both men felt the weight of the task ahead. The road to redemption would be long and fraught with challenges. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But in that moment, standing side by side on the ground that represented both their families' past mistakes and future hopes, Alexander and Ethan Blackwood were united in their determination. They would uncover the truth no matter how painful. They would make amends, no matter the cost. And in doing so, they would redefine not just the Blackwood legacy, but the very nature of corporate responsibility in the modern world. The echoes of the past still resonated, but they were being transformed into a clarion call for change. And as father and son walked away from the site, their steps in sync, they carried with them the hope of a new beginning, not just for themselves, but for all those whose lives had been touched by the Blackwood name. The sun dipped below the horizon, marking the end of another day. But for the Blackwoods, it felt like the dawn of a new era, one built on truth, responsibility, and the unwavering commitment to do what was right, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. The early spring sun peeked through the windows of Blackwood Enterprises' newly renovated headquarters, casting a warm glow over the conference room where Alexander and Ethan sat, surrounded by stacks of documents and laptops displaying complex spreadsheets. The past few months had been a whirlwind of activity as they delved deeper into the company's history, uncovering decades of questionable practices and hidden truths. "I think we've found something, Dad," Ethan said, his voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. He swiveled his laptop around, showing Alexander a series of financial transactions dating back nearly 30 years. Look at these payments. They're all to shell companies, but I've managed to trace them back to a single source. Alexander leaned in, his brow furrowing as he studied the screen. Catherine Reynolds, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, this is my birth mother, Ethan finished, his eyes meeting his father's. I know, and look at the dates. These payments started right after I was born and continued for years. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Alexander felt a familiar mix of guilt and anger rising within him. Hush money, he said, his voice tight. My father was paying her off to keep quiet about you. Ethan nodded, his expression conflicted. But why did they stop abruptly 5 years ago? And more importantly, where is she now? Before Alexander could respond, there was a knock at the door. Margaret, who had remained with the company through its tumultuous transformation, entered with a grim expression. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, her voice tense, but there's someone here to see you, both of you. She says her name is Catherine Reynolds. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Alexander and Ethan exchanged shocked glances. After a moment of stunned silence, Alexander found his voice. Show her in, Margaret. Please. As Margaret left to fetch their unexpected visitor, Ethan stood pacing the room nervously. Dad, I don't know if I'm ready for this. Alexander moved to his son's side, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. We'll face this together, Ethan. Whatever happens, we're in this as a family. The door opened, and a woman in her early 50s entered. Her auburn hair was streaked with grey, and her green eyes, so like Ethan's, were filled with a mixture of determination and fear. Hello, Alexander, she said softly, before turning her gaze to Ethan. And you must be my son. The next hour was a blur of emotions as Catherine shared her story. She spoke of her whirlwind romance with Alexander, of the joy and fear she felt upon discovering her pregnancy, and of the crushing pressure exerted by the elder Blackwood to give up her child. I never wanted to let you go, she told Ethan, tears streaming down her face. But your grandfather, and he made it clear that if I didn't, he would use his influence to ensure I never saw you again. The payments were supposed to be for your care, but I think they were really to keep me quiet, to keep me away. Alexander listened, his heart heavy with the weight of his family's sins. Why come forward now, Catherine? After all these years? Catherine's expression hardened slightly. Because I saw what you and Ethan are trying to do with the company, the changes you're making, the truths you're uncovering. I realized that if there was ever a time to come clean, to try to make things right, it was now. As the conversation continued, the full extent of the elder Blackwood's machinations came to light. Catherine revealed documents she had kept hidden for years, proof of not just her payoffs, but of other families and individuals who had been silenced or strong-armed by Blackwood Enterprises over the decades. This is bigger than we imagined, Ethan said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and determination as he pored over the documents. Dad, if we make this public, it could destroy everything we've been working towards. Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of their decision pressing down on him. You're right. But if we don't, if we keep these secrets buried, are we any better than those who came before us? The room fell silent as the three of them contemplated the magnitude of the situation. It was Catherine who finally broke the silence, her voice soft but resolute. I've spent years living with the guilt of giving up my son, of staying silent in the face of injustice, she said. I can't change the past, but I can help shape the future. Whatever you decide to do with this information, I want to help. It's time for the truth to come out, no matter the consequences. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the conference room, Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine found themselves at a crossroads. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with legal, ethical, and personal challenges. But as they sat together, this unlikely family unit forged in secrets and reunited by a shared commitment to truth, there was also a sense of hope. So, Ethan said, looking from his father to his newly discovered mother, where do we go from here? Alexander took a deep breath, his mind racing with the possibilities and pitfalls that lay ahead. We do what we set out to do from the beginning, he said firmly. We tell the truth, all of it, and we face the consequences together. As night fell over the city, the lights of the Blackwood building shone like a beacon in the darkness. Inside, 3 generations of Blackwoods, past, present, and future, began the painstaking process of unraveling decades of secrets and planning for a future built on honesty and redemption. The road ahead would be difficult, the waters uncharted. But as they worked through the night, fueled by a shared determination to right the wrongs of the past, there was a sense that they were embarking on something truly transformative, not just for themselves or for Blackwood Enterprises, but for the very notion of corporate responsibility and family legacy. As dawn broke, bringing with it the promise of a new day, Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine emerged from the conference room, tired but resolute. They had made their decision. It was time to take Blackwood Enterprises and themselves into uncharted waters, guided by the unwavering light of truth and the hope for a better future. The auditorium of Blackwood Enterprises headquarters was packed to capacity, a sea of faces reflecting a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and anticipation. Journalists from major news outlets jostled for position, their cameras trained on the empty podium at the front of the room. The air was thick with tension, the low murmur of conversation punctuated by the occasional flash of a camera. Backstage, Alexander Blackwood adjusted his tie, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to face the crowd. Beside him, Ethan paced nervously, while Catherine sat quietly, her eyes closed as if in silent prayer. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, pausing to look at his father. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Alexander nodded, his expression a mix of determination and resignation. "It's time, son. We've spent too long hiding from the truth. Whatever happens next, at least we'll be able to look ourselves in the mirror." A stagehand appeared, signaling that it was time. As they moved towards the stage, Catherine stood, reaching out to grasp both Alexander and Ethan's hands. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "we face it as a family." The roar of the crowd hit them as they stepped onto the stage, the flashes of cameras momentarily blinding. Alexander approached the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. As he looked out over the sea of faces, he caught sight of familiar ones: Sarah Jennings, Frank from the Millbrook plant, members of the Community Oversight Board. Their presence gave him strength. "Good morning," Alexander began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Thank you all for coming. Today, Blackwood Enterprises stands at a crossroads, not just as a company, but as a part of the communities we've impacted over the decades." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Over the past year, we've embarked on a journey of transformation, seeking to right the wrongs of our past and build a more ethical, sustainable future. But as we've dug deeper into our history, we've uncovered truths that can no longer remain hidden." A hush fell over the crowd as Alexander began to detail the extent of Blackwood Enterprises' past misdeeds. He spoke of environmental violations covered up for decades, of families displaced by aggressive expansion, of lives altered by corporate greed. With each revelation, the audience's reaction shifted from shock to anger to a sort of grim determination. "These actions were carried out under the leadership of my father, and later under my own," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "I cannot change the past, but I can take responsibility for it. And more importantly, I can commit to making it right." He gestured for Ethan and Catherine to join him at the podium. "This is my son, Ethan, whom many of you know, and this is Catherine Reynolds, Ethan's birth mother. Their story is just one of many that exemplify the human cost of our company's past actions." Ethan stepped forward, his voice clear and strong as he addressed the crowd. "For years, I believed I was adopted. The truth, that I was born out of wedlock and hidden away to protect the company's image, is just one example of the culture of secrecy and manipulation that has plagued Blackwood Enterprises for generations." Catherine spoke next, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as she continued. "I was paid to stay silent, to stay away from my son, but I can't be silent anymore. None of us can." As they continued to speak, laying bare the full extent of Blackwood's past transgressions, the atmosphere in the room shifted. There was anger, yes, but also a growing sense of respect for the honesty being displayed. Alexander returned to the podium for the final part of their presentation. "We stand before you today not to ask for forgiveness, but to commit to action. Effective immediately, Blackwood Enterprises will be establishing a substantial restitution fund for those affected by our past actions. We will be cooperating fully with all relevant authorities to address any legal ramifications of our disclosures. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. Furthermore, we are proposing a radical restructuring of our company. We want to transition Blackwood Enterprises into a benefit corporation, with a legally binding commitment to balance profit with social and environmental impact. The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the audience. Alexander pressed on, outlining their vision for a new kind of corporation, one that prioritized transparency, community involvement, and long-term sustainability over short-term profits. As he concluded his speech, Alexander braced himself for the reaction. For a moment, the room was silent. Then slowly applause began to build. It wasn't universal, there were still plenty of skeptical faces in the crowd, but it was genuine. The press conference that followed was intense, with journalists peppering the Blackwood family with hard-hitting questions. Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine faced them head-on, their honesty and commitment to transparency evident in every response. As the event finally wound down, Alexander found himself exhausted but strangely exhilarated. They had done it. They had laid bare the sins of the past and committed themselves to a new path. The hard work was only beginning, but for the first time in years, he felt truly aligned with his purpose. Later that evening, as Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine sat in the quiet of his office, watching the sun set over the city, there was a sense of both accomplishment and trepidation. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, voicing the question on all their minds. Alexander smiled softly, reaching out to clasp his son's shoulder. "Now, we build. We make good on our promises. We prove that a corporation can be a force for good in the world." Ethan joined his father, adding his own perspective. "And it's not just us. Our actions have sparked a movement. Other companies are following our lead, re-examining their own practices. We're changing the conversation about corporate responsibility on a global scale." The room fell silent as the weight of their words sank in. Even the most skeptical board members seemed to be reconsidering their positions. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside the conference room. Margaret burst in, her usually composed demeanor shaken. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said breathlessly, "but you need to see this." She turned on the large screen at the end of the room, tuning it to a major news network. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made everyone's jaw drop. Tech giant Megacorp embroiled in massive scandal. CEO cites Blackwood Enterprises as inspiration for coming clean. The newscaster's voice filled the room. In a shocking turn of events, Megacorp, one of the world's largest technology companies, has voluntarily disclosed years of ethical violations and questionable business practices. In a statement, CEO Lisa Chen said the recent actions of Blackwood Enterprises inspired her to choose transparency over deception, responsibility over profit at any cost. The room erupted in a buzz of excited conversation. Alexander and Ethan exchanged a look of amazement, barely able to process the magnitude of what was happening. "Don't you see?" Ethan said, raising his voice to be heard over the commotion. "This is bigger than our stock price. We're changing the way business is done. We're creating a new normal." Alexander nodded, a mix of pride and determination on his face. "This is why we can't back down, why we can't slow our efforts. We're not just weathering a storm, we're causing one, a storm that's shaking the foundations of corporate America." As the news continued to unfold on the screen, detailing the far-reaching implications of Megacorp's disclosure, the mood in the room began to shift. The fear and doubt that had dominated the meeting were giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. Vernon, who had been the most vocal about his financial concerns, spoke up. "All right, I see your point, but we still need to address our immediate financial challenges. How do we stay afloat while we wait for the rest of the world to catch up?" This sparked a lively discussion, with board members offering suggestions and debating strategies. As Alexander watched, he felt a surge of hope. This was no longer a group of executives looking to protect their bottom line. This was a team united in a common cause, working together to solve complex problems. Hours passed as they hammered out a plan, a delicate balance of cost-cutting measures, innovative fundraising strategies, and a redoubling of their commitment to transparent, ethical practices. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a path forward that everyone could believe in. As the meeting finally adjourned, Alexander found himself alone in the conference room with Ethan. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, a visual reminder of all the lives touched by their decisions. "We did it, Dad," Ethan said softly. "We held the line." Alexander nodded, feeling a complex mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "We did. But this is just the beginning. The real test is still to come." As if on cue, Catherine appeared in the doorway, a tentative smile on her face. "I heard about what happened," she said. "The megacorp news is all over the internet. You've started a revolution." Alexander chuckled, the sound tinged with both amusement and disbelief. A revolution. Who would have thought the Blackwood name would ever be associated with something like that? The three of them stood together, looking out over the city, each lost in their own thoughts about the future. The path ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges they had yet to face. But there was also a sense of hope, of possibility that hadn't existed before. "Whatever comes next," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "we face it together, as a family, as a company, as part of something bigger than ourselves." Alexander and Catherine nodded in agreement. As they left the conference room, walking together through the quieting offices, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace. They had weathered this storm, and they would weather the next, and the next after that. For the Blackwood legacy was no longer about profit margins or stock prices. It was about integrity, about responsibility, about the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult. And that, Alexander realized, was a legacy that could withstand any storm. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the wind had died down and the sky was clear. Stars twinkled overhead, distant but bright, like the promise of a better future. And in that moment, Alexander knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they were on the right path, a path that led not just to the redemption of a company, but to the transformation of an entire industry, and perhaps, in some small way, the world itself. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to peek over the horizon as Alexander Blackwood made his way into the federal courthouse. The weight of the day ahead pressed heavily upon his shoulders, but there was a steely determination in his eyes. Today was the beginning of the government's investigation into Blackwood Enterprises' past misdeeds, and Alexander was prepared to face whatever consequences may come. As he approached the entrance, he saw Ethan and Catherine waiting for him, their faces a mixture of concern and support. "Are you ready for this, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice low and serious. Alexander nodded, straightening his tie. "As ready as I'll ever be. Remember, no matter what happens in there, we stick to the truth, all of it." The trio made their way through security and into the austere hearing room. Already, it was packed with journalists, industry watchdogs, and curious members of the public. At the front, a panel of stern-faced government officials sat ready to begin the proceedings. As Alexander took his seat at the witness table, he could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Agent Rossi, began her questioning without preamble. "Mr. Blackwood, you've come forward with some very serious allegations about your company's past practices. Can you tell us why, after all these years, you've chosen to disclose this information now?" Alexander leaned into the microphone, his voice steady. "The simple answer, Agent Rossi, is that it was the right thing to do. For too long, Blackwood Enterprises operated under a cloud of secrecy and moral compromise. I realized that true change, true redemption, could only come through complete transparency." The questions that followed were relentless, probing into every dark corner of Blackwood's history. Alexander answered each one honestly, often providing even more damning information than the investigators had uncovered on their own. He could see the surprise on their faces, clearly unused to such forthright testimony from a corporate executive. As the day wore on, the scope of Blackwood's past transgressions became clear. Environmental violations, labor law infringements, financial improprieties. The list seemed endless. Yet with each revelation, Alexander also detailed the steps the company was taking to make amends, to change its practices, to become a force for good in the world. During a brief recess, Ethan approached his father, his face etched with concern. "Dad, are you sure about this? Some of what you're revealing, it could lead to criminal charges." Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression resolute. "I know, Ethan. But we can't build a better future on a foundation of lies. Whatever the consequences, we face them head on." As the hearing resumed, the tone of the questioning began to shift. The investigators, initially skeptical, seemed increasingly intrigued by Blackwood's new direction. Agent Rossi, in particular, pressed Alexander on the company's plans for the future. "Mr. Blackwood, given the extent of your company's past violations, why should we believe that anything has truly changed? How can you assure this panel and the public that Blackwood Enterprises is genuinely committed to reform?" Alexander paused, considering his words carefully. "Agent Rossi, I can't undo the past. The mistakes we made, the people we hurt, that will always be part of our legacy. But what I can do, what we are doing, is working tirelessly to build a new legacy. One of transparency, accountability, and positive impact." He went on to detail the company's radical restructuring, its new benefit corporation status, the oversight committees, and ethical guidelines now in place. As he spoke, there was a palpable shift in the room. The hostility that had marked the early part of the day was giving way to a cautious respect. As the hearing finally drew to a close, Alexander felt drained but oddly invigorated. They had faced their past head-on, laid bare their sins for all to see. Whatever came next, they would face it with clear consciences. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters awaited them. Questions were shouted from all directions, cameras flashed incessantly. Alexander raised his hands, calling for quiet. "Today was about facing our past," he began, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps, "about taking responsibility for mistakes made over decades. But it was also about charting a new course. Blackwood Enterprises is committed to not just changing our own practices, but to changing the very nature of how business is done." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. "We know we have a long way to go to earn back the public's trust, but we're ready for that journey. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about saving a company. It's about proving that corporations can be a force for good in the world. That profit and ethics aren't mutually exclusive, that it's never too late to choose to do the right thing." As Alexander finished speaking, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then, slowly, applause began to build. It wasn't universal. There were still plenty of skeptical faces in the crowd, but it was genuine. People were moved by the sincerity of his words, by the boldness of Blackwood's new vision. Later that evening, as Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine sat in the quiet of their home, the enormity of the day's events began to sink in. The news channels were abuzz with analysis of the hearing, with speculation about what it might mean for the future of corporate accountability. "What happens now?" Catherine asked softly, voicing the question on all their minds. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Now, we wait. The government will review everything we've disclosed, decide on any penalties or charges, but whatever comes, we face it together." Ethan nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "And we keep moving forward. We've started something here, Dad, something bigger than just Blackwood Enterprises." As night fell over the city, the Blackwood family sat together, united in their commitment to seeing this journey through. They had passed through the crucible of public scrutiny, emerged battered but unbroken. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was a road they could walk with pride. The Blackwood legacy was being rewritten, not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the courage to face hard truths and the determination to forge a better path. And as Alexander looked at his son and the mother of his child, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family, guided by the light of truth and the hope for a better tomorrow. A year had passed since the fateful government hearing, and the landscape of corporate America had shifted dramatically. Blackwood Enterprises, once a symbol of unchecked corporate greed, had become a beacon of ethical business practices and social responsibility. The ripple effect of their transformation had spread far and wide, inspiring and in some cases forcing other companies to reevaluate their own practices. On a bright spring morning, Alexander Blackwood stood at the podium in the newly christened Blackwood Center for Corporate Ethics, addressing a packed auditorium of business leaders, activists, and students. The center, built on the grounds of the old Blackwood plant, was a physical manifestation of the company's commitment to change. "A year ago," Alexander began, his voice strong and clear, "we stood before the world and laid bare the sins of our past. We faced harsh truths, accepted responsibility for decades of misdeeds, and promised to chart a new course. Today I'm here to report on that journey, not just for Blackwood Enterprises, but for the broader movement towards ethical, sustainable business practices that we helped ignite. As Alexander spoke, detailing the challenges and triumphs of the past year, Ethan watched from the wings, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. The road had not been easy. There had been legal battles, financial struggles, and moments of doubt. But through it all, they had stayed true to their vision. Alexander continued, his passion evident in every word. We've seen a seismic shift in the corporate world. Companies that once prioritized profit at any cost are now competing to be leaders in sustainability and social responsibility. It's not just about avoiding negative impact anymore. It's about actively working to make the world better. He went on to outline some of the concrete changes that had taken place. Blackwood Enterprises had fully transitioned to renewable energy, implemented industry-leading labor practices, and launched initiatives to restore ecosystems damaged by their past actions. More importantly, they had opened their books completely, inviting independent auditors and community oversight boards to ensure they were living up to their promises. As Alexander concluded his speech, the applause was thunderous. But it wasn't just the audience in the auditorium who were moved. Unbeknownst to Alexander, his words were being broadcast live across the country, reaching millions of viewers who had tuned in to witness this milestone in corporate history. After the speech, as Alexander made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and answering questions, he was approached by a familiar face, Agent Rossi, the lead investigator from the government hearing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, a note of respect in her voice. "I have to admit, I was skeptical a year ago. I've seen too many corporate apologies that turned out to be nothing but PR stunts. But what you've done here, it's unprecedented." Alexander smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you, Agent Rossi. But we're just getting started. There's still so much work to be done." As the day wore on, Alexander found himself in a series of meetings and panel discussions, all focused on the future of ethical business practices. CEOs from other major corporations sought his advice. Activists who had once protested against Blackwood now worked alongside them, and a new generation of business students looked to the company as a model for their own aspirations. Late in the afternoon, Alexander finally found a moment of quiet. He stepped outside into the garden that had been planted where the old factory's parking lot once stood. Here, amidst the blooming flowers and buzzing bees, he felt the full weight of the transformation they had undergone. He was soon joined by Ethan and Catherine, both of whom had played crucial roles in the day's events. Ethan had led a workshop on transparent financial practices, while Catherine had shared her story as part of a panel on corporate accountability. "Can you believe it, Dad?" Ethan said, his eyes shining with excitement. "A year ago we were facing federal investigations and public outrage. Now we're leading a global movement." Catherine nodded, a soft smile on her face. "It's more than I ever dreamed possible. But Alexander, are you ready for what comes next? The world is watching us now, expecting us to lead the way." Alexander took a deep breath, looking out over the garden. In the distance, he could see the skyline of the city, a reminder of the broader world they were trying to change. "I'm ready," he said softly. "We've come too far to turn back now. Whatever challenges lie ahead, we'll face them together." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the Blackwood Center, the three of them stood in companionable silence. They had rewritten the Blackwood legacy, transforming it from a cautionary tale into a story of redemption and hope. But more than that, they had planted the seeds of change in the broader corporate world. Alexander knew that the journey was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new battles to fight. The forces of greed and short-term thinking were still strong in the business world. But as he stood there with his family, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, he felt a sense of hope that he hadn't experienced in years. The Blackwood name, once synonymous with corporate excess, was now becoming a rallying cry for a new way of doing business. A way that balanced profit with social responsibility, that prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term gains. It was a legacy that Alexander could be proud to pass on to future generations. As they turned to head back inside, ready to face whatever the future might bring, Alexander felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had weathered the storm, faced their past, and emerged stronger for it. Now it was time to look forward, to continue the work of building a better, more ethical business world. The seeds of change had been planted, and with nurturing and care, they would grow into a forest of possibility, changing the landscape of corporate America, and perhaps the world, for generations to come. The Blackwood legacy, once tarnished by greed and secrecy, now shone as a beacon of hope and transformation. And that, Alexander realized, was the greatest achievement of all. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of anticipation as Alexander Blackwood stood at the edge of a vast field, once barren and contaminated, now teeming with the promise of new life. Rows of solar panels stretched as far as the eye could see, their surfaces gleaming in the early morning sun. This was the site of Blackwood Enterprises' most ambitious project yet, a state-of-the-art renewable energy facility built on reclaimed land. Beside him, Ethan surveyed the scene with a mix of pride and determination. "It's incredible, isn't it?" he said, his voice tinged with awe. "To think, just a few years ago, this was a toxic wasteland. Now it's powering homes and businesses across 3 states. Alexander nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's more than just an energy project, Ethan. It's a symbol of what's possible when we commit to doing things the right way." As they walked among the solar arrays, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The past 2 years had been a whirlwind of change, not just for Blackwood Enterprises, but for the entire corporate landscape. Their bold moves towards transparency and ethical business practices had sparked a revolution, forcing other companies to follow suit or risk being left behind. Their tour was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine, who jogged up to them with an excited gleam in her eye. "You both need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. "The results from the latest environmental impact study just came in." As they huddled around the screen, Alexander felt a surge of emotion. The data showed a dramatic improvement in local air and water quality, the return of native plant and animal species, and a significant reduction in carbon emissions for the entire region. "This is it," Ethan breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "This is the proof we've been waiting for. We're not just talking about change anymore, we're making it happen." Their moment of celebration was interrupted by the buzz of Alexander's phone. It was Margaret, her voice tight with urgency. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation developing at headquarters. The board is calling an emergency meeting." Alexander's brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on, Margaret?" "It's the Hartley merger, sir," she replied. "There are complications." As they rushed back to the city, Alexander briefed Ethan and Catherine on the situation. Blackwood Enterprises had been in talks to merge with Hartley Industries, a major player in the tech sector. The merger promised to combine Blackwood's ethical business model with Hartley's cutting-edge technology, creating a powerhouse for sustainable innovation. But now, it seemed, there were roadblocks. As they entered the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Vernon Holbrook, the CFO, was in the middle of a heated explanation. "The Hartley board is getting cold feet," he said, his face flushed with frustration. "They're concerned that our ethical standards are too stringent, that they'll cut into profits too severely. They're threatening to pull out of the deal." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, board members arguing about the best course of action. Some advocated for compromising on their standards to save the merger, while others insisted on standing firm. Alexander raised his hands, calling for silence. "Let's not forget what we've built here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Our commitment to ethical practices isn't just a selling point, it's the foundation of everything we do. If Hartley can't see the value in that, then perhaps this merger isn't meant to be." Ethan stepped forward, adding his perspective. "Dad's right. We've proven that ethical business can be profitable. We shouldn't have to compromise our values to convince others of that fact." As the debate continued, Catherine noticed something odd. "Wait a minute," she said, peering at the financial report spread across the table. "These projections, they don't match up with our actual performance data." A hush fell over the room as Catherine pointed out discrepancies in the merger documents. It quickly became clear that someone had manipulated the data, making Blackwood's ethical practices appear more costly than they actually were. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "This goes beyond cold feet," he said gravely. "Someone is actively trying to sabotage this merger. The revelation sent shockwaves through the board. Who could be behind this deception? Was it someone within Blackwood, clinging to old ways of doing business? Or was there an external force at work, threatened by the changes Blackwood was spearheading in the corporate world? As the day wore on, Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. They combed through financial records, interviewed staff, and reached out to contacts at Hartley Industries. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, one of a coordinated effort to undermine Blackwood's ethical revolution. Late into the night, as they pored over documents in Alexander's office, Ethan made a breakthrough. "Dad, look at this," he said, pointing to a series of buried transactions. "These shell companies, they all lead back to Global Dynamics." Alexander's eyes widened in recognition. Global Dynamics was one of the old guard, a multinational conglomerate known for its ruthless business practices and disregard for environmental concerns. They had been one of the most vocal critics of Blackwood's new direction. "They're scared," Catherine realized, her voice a mix of anger and determination. "They see what we're doing, how we're changing the game, and they're trying to stop it before it goes any further." Alexander leaned back in his chair, a grim smile on his face. "Well, they've underestimated us before. We didn't come this far to be stopped now." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the Blackwood family formulated their plan. They would not only expose the deception, but use it as an opportunity to demonstrate the true power of their ethical approach. Alexander looked at Ethan and Catherine, seeing in their faces the same resolve he felt. "This is more than just a merger now," he said softly. "This is a battle for the soul of corporate America. Are you ready?" Ethan and Catherine nodded, their eyes shining with determination. Together, they stepped out of the office and into the new day, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The new frontier of ethical business was fraught with obstacles, but the Blackwoods were prepared to blaze the trail, no matter the cost. As they walked towards the boardroom where the future of Blackwood Enterprises and perhaps the entire corporate world would be decided, Alexander felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. They had transformed their company, inspired a movement, and now they were poised to change the very nature of business itself. The battle ahead would be tough, but as Alexander looked at his son and the mother of his child, he knew they were ready. The Blackwood legacy, once tarnished by greed and secrecy, now stood as a beacon of hope and change. And they would fight with everything they had to ensure that light continued to shine, illuminating a path towards a more ethical, sustainable future for all. The Blackwood Enterprises boardroom buzzed with tension as Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine presented their findings. Board members leaned forward in their seats, faces etched with a mix of shock and determination as the full extent of Global Dynamics' sabotage attempt was revealed. "This isn't just about our merger anymore," Alexander concluded, his voice resonating with conviction. "This is about the future of ethical business practices worldwide. Global Dynamics and others like them are fighting to maintain a status quo that's destroying our planet and exploiting people. We have a chance to change that right here, right now." Ethan stepped forward, pulling up a series of projections on the main screen. "We've run the numbers," he said, his confidence bolstering the room. "If we expose Global Dynamics tactics and double down on our commitment to ethical practices, we don't just save the Hartley merger, we position ourselves as the undisputed leaders in corporate responsibility." The board erupted into discussion, the energy in the room palpable. Some voiced concerns about potential retaliation from Global Dynamics, while others saw the opportunity to make a lasting impact on the business world. Catherine, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "We've always said that transparency is our greatest strength, so let's use it. We go public with everything, the sabotage attempt, our true financials, our vision for the future. We show the world that ethical business isn't just viable, it's the only sustainable path forward." A hush fell over the room as the weight of the decision settled upon them. This wasn't just a corporate strategy. It was a defining moment that could reshape the entire landscape of global business. Alexander looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. "I won't pretend this isn't a risk," he said solemnly. "Global Dynamics and their allies will fight back hard. We could lose partners, contracts, maybe even some of our own people, but I believe this is a fight worth having. Who's with me?" One by one, the board members voiced their support. Even those who had been skeptical in the past recognized the significance of the moment. As the vote was tallied, it was unanimous. Blackwood Enterprises would take a stand. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine worked around the clock, preparing their case and coordinating with allies in the media, government, and activist communities. The anticipation built as word spread of an upcoming Blackwood press conference that promised to shake the foundations of the corporate world. On the morning of the announcement, Alexander stood before a sea of reporters, cameras flashing as he took his place at the podium. Ethan and Catherine flanked him, a united front against the forces that sought to undermine their vision. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice steady and clear, "today, Blackwood Enterprises stands at a crossroads, not just for our company, but for the future of business itself." Over the next hour, Alexander laid out the entire story: the merger plans, Global Dynamics' sabotage attempt, and Blackwood's unwavering commitment to ethical practices. He presented hard data showing the financial viability of their approach and unveiled plans for even more ambitious sustainability initiatives. "We are here to declare unequivocally that the era of profit at any cost is over," Alexander said, his passion evident in every word. "We challenge Global Dynamics and every other company clinging to outdated, destructive practices to join us in building a better future. And to those who continue to prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability, we say this: your time is up." The press conference sent shockwaves through the business world. Social media exploded with reactions, stock markets fluctuated wildly, and corporate boardrooms across the globe convened emergency meetings. In the days that followed, the battle lines were drawn. Global Dynamics and their allies launched a fierce counteroffensive, using their considerable resources to discredit Blackwood's claims and defend the old way of doing business. But Blackwood wasn't alone. Other companies, inspired by their stand, began to come forward with their own stories of coercion and sabotage. A movement was building, gaining momentum with each passing day. Consumers began boycotting companies associated with Global Dynamics, while Blackwood's partners and clients reaffirmed their commitment to ethical business practices. Amidst the chaos, the Hartley merger moved forward, stronger than ever. Jonathan Hartley himself made a public statement supporting Blackwood's stance, cementing the partnership as a powerful force for change in the tech industry. Weeks turned into months, and the corporate landscape began to shift. Companies that had once been staunch defenders of the old guard started to change their tunes, implementing new ethical guidelines and sustainability initiatives. Global Dynamics, facing mounting pressure from shareholders and regulators, announced a strategic restructuring that many saw as the beginning of the end for their unethical practices. Throughout it all, Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine remained at the forefront of the movement. They testified before congressional committees, spoke at international forums, and worked tirelessly to support other companies transitioning to more ethical models. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of Blackwood headquarters, looking out over the city skyline, Alexander felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over him. "Do you remember when we started this journey?" he asked softly, turning to Ethan and Catherine. "We thought we were just trying to save our company. But look at what we've started." Ethan nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "We've changed the conversation. Companies aren't just asking if they can be ethical anymore, they're realizing they have to be." Catherine squeezed Alexander's hand, her voice thick with emotion. "And we've done it as a family. Despite everything, despite all the secrets and lies that came before, we've built something truly meaningful together." As the sun set on another day of their ongoing revolution, Alexander Blackwood felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was still long, the fight far from over, but they had turned a corner, reached a point of no return. The business world would never be the same again. The Blackwood legacy, once a cautionary tale of corporate greed, had become a beacon of hope for a more ethical, sustainable future. And as Alexander stood there with his son and the mother of his child, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family, as a company, and as leaders of a movement that was changing the world, one ethical decision at a time. The turning point had come, and Blackwood Enterprises was leading the way into a new era of corporate responsibility. The future, at last, looked bright, not just for their company, but but for the entire world. 5 years had passed since Blackwood Enterprises' groundbreaking stand against corporate malfeasance, and the world of business had undergone a seismic shift. The Blackwood-Hartley merger had become a case study in ethical corporate practices, inspiring a wave of similar partnerships across industries. Alexander Blackwood, now in his early 60s, stood at the podium of the United Nations Global Compact Summit, addressing a room full of world leaders, corporate executives, and activists. "When we began this journey," Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "we were told that ethical business practices and profitability were mutually exclusive. Today we stand as living proof that not only can they coexist, but they are essential for long-term success and global sustainability." As he spoke, Alexander couldn't help but reflect on the transformative years that had led to this moment. The battle against global dynamics had been long and hard fought, but ultimately, it had catalyzed a revolution in corporate governance. Companies that had once prioritized short-term gains at any cost were now competing to be leaders in sustainability and social responsibility. Ethan, now a respected figure in his own right, sat in the front row, beaming with pride as his father outlined Blackwood Enterprises' latest initiatives. The company had expanded its renewable energy projects globally, pioneered breakthrough technologies in environmental restoration, and implemented industry-leading labor practices that were being adopted worldwide. As Alexander concluded his speech to thunderous applause, he felt a familiar hand on his shoulder. Catherine, who had become an influential advocate for corporate transparency, stood beside him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You did it, Alex," she said softly. "You've changed the world." Alexander shook his head, a humble smile on his face. "We did it, all of us. It was never just about one company or one family. It was about proving that change is possible, that we can build a better future if we're willing to fight for it." The rest of the summit was a whirlwind of meetings, panel discussions, and negotiations. Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine found themselves at the center of it all, their expertise and experience sought after by leaders from every corner of the globe. The Blackwood name, once synonymous with corporate greed, had become a beacon of hope and progress. As the event wound down, the Blackwood family retreated to a quiet corner of the conference center. They were joined by Sarah Jennings, now the governor of their home state, and Frank, the former union leader, who had become a key ally in their quest for ethical business practices. "I never thought I'd see the day," Frank said, shaking his head in wonder. "Union leaders and CEOs working together, companies competing to be the most socially responsible. It's like a whole new world." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And it all started with you three," she said, looking at Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine with admiration. "You took a stand when it would have been easier to look the other way. You risked everything to do what was right." As they reminisced about the challenges they had faced and overcome, Alexander felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. The path had not been easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, and fierce opposition. But through it all they had persevered, driven by a shared vision of a more equitable and sustainable world. Ethan, who had been quietly observing the conversation, suddenly spoke up. "You know, when we started this, I thought it was about saving a company. Then I thought it was about changing an industry. But now I see it was about something much bigger. We've redefined what it means to be successful in business." Catherine reached out, squeezing Ethan's hand. "And in doing so, we've redefined our own legacy. The Blackwood name will be remembered not for what it once was, but for what it became, a catalyst for positive change." As the sun set on the final day of the summit, Alexander stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline. He thought about his father, about the old Blackwood Enterprises, about the years of secrets and compromise. It all seemed so distant now, like a half-remembered dream. Ethan joined him, following his gaze out to the horizon. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Alexander smiled, turning to face his son. "I'm thinking about legacy, Ethan, about the power we have to shape the future, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come." As they stood there, father and son, the architects of a new era in corporate responsibility, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace. They had faced their past, confronted their mistakes, and emerged stronger for it. The Blackwood legacy had been redefined, not through words or promises, but through actions that had changed the very fabric of the business world. The journey wasn't over. There would always be new challenges to face, new battles to fight. But as Alexander looked at Ethan, at Catherine, at the allies they had made along the way, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. United by a shared commitment to ethics, sustainability, and the belief that business could be a force for good in the world. The Blackwood legacy, once tarnished by greed and secrecy, now shone as a beacon of hope and transformation. And that, Alexander realized, was the greatest achievement of all. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling Blackwood Enterprises campus as Alexander made his way towards the main building. Today marked a significant milestone, his last day as CEO before officially handing over the reins to Ethan. As he walked, Alexander couldn't help but marvel at the transformation around him. The once sterile corporate headquarters had been reimagined as a hub of innovation and sustainability. Solar panels glinted on every rooftop, while carefully tended gardens and green spaces bustled with employees enjoying the fresh air before starting their workday. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a mix of excitement and nostalgia. Employees from every department had gathered in the atrium, their faces beaming with admiration and respect as Alexander made his way through the crowd. Many of them had been with the company through its darkest days and subsequent rebirth, and their loyalty was a testament to the culture of trust and purpose that had been cultivated over the years. As Alexander reached the podium, he saw Ethan and Catherine in the front row, their eyes shining with pride and love. Taking a deep breath, he began his farewell address. 25 years ago, he started, his voice steady and warm. I stood before a very different gathering in this very building. We were a company in crisis, facing the consequences of decades of misguided priorities and hidden truths. Today, we stand as a living example of what's possible when we choose to do business differently. Alexander went on to recount the journey they had all taken together, the challenges they had overcome, the innovations they had pioneered, and the lives they had touched along the way. He spoke of the global impact of their ethical business model, how it had inspired a new generation of entrepreneurs and forced even the most entrenched corporations to reevaluate their practices. But our work is far from over, he continued, his voice taking on a note of urgency. The world still faces enormous challenges: climate change, inequality, resource depletion. The need for ethical, forward-thinking business leadership has never been greater. At this, Alexander gestured for Ethan to join him at the podium. As his son stepped up beside him, Alexander felt a surge of emotion. It is with great pride and absolute confidence that I hand over leadership of Blackwood Enterprises to my son, Ethan Blackwood. Ethan has been instrumental in our company's transformation, and I know he will lead us into a future even brighter than we can imagine. The atrium erupted in applause as Ethan embraced his father, the torch of leadership passing from one generation to the next. As the cheers subsided, Ethan stepped up to the microphone, his face a mixture of determination and humility. "Thank you, Dad," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "And thank you to every member of the Blackwood family, because that's what we are, a family united in purpose. The trust you've placed in us, the dedication you've shown, it's what has made our success possible." Ethan went on to outline his vision for the future of Blackwood Enterprises, expanding their renewable energy initiatives, investing in breakthrough technologies for environmental restoration, and launching a global mentorship program to nurture the next generation of ethical business leaders. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Alexander found himself surrounded by well-wishers. Employees shared personal stories of how the company's transformation had impacted their lives, from providing opportunities for meaningful work to inspiring them to become advocates for change in their own communities. In a quiet moment amidst the celebrations, Alexander, Ethan, and Catherine slipped away to Alexander's office, soon to be Ethan's. As they stood looking out over the campus, Catherine broke the contemplative silence. "I never could have imagined this," she said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "When I gave Ethan up all those years ago, I thought I was condemning him to a life of secrets and corporate greed. And now look at what you've built together." Alexander put his arm around her, drawing her close. "We built it together, all of us, including you, Catherine. Your courage in coming forward, in facing the past, it was a crucial part of our journey." Ethan nodded in agreement, his gaze moving between his parents. "You both taught me the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to change course, to choose a better path. That's the real Blackwood legacy." As they stood there, this unconventional family unit forged through years of struggle and triumph, Alexander felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. They had faced their past, righted old wrongs, and created something truly meaningful in the process. The Blackwood name, once a symbol of corporate excess, now stood for integrity, innovation, and positive global impact. It was a legacy that would endure, not through accumulation of wealth or power, but through the ripple effect of lives touched and perspectives changed. As the day wore on and the torch-passing celebrations continued, Alexander found moments to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. He thought of his father, of the old Blackwood enterprises, of the years of compromise and hidden truths. There was sadness there, but also gratitude for the wake-up call that had set them on this transformative path. The sun was setting as Alexander finally prepared to leave the office for the last time as CEO. As he packed up the last of his personal items, his eyes fell on an old photograph, himself as a young man standing proudly beside his father at the opening of the first Blackwood plant. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what his father might think of the company now. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. It was Ethan, come to walk out with him one last time. "Ready, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. Alexander nodded, taking a final look around the office. "Ready," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of emotions, nostalgia, pride, and excitement for the future. As they walked out of the building together, the last rays of sunlight painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Alexander felt a profound sense of completion. The Blackwood legacy had been redefined, not just for their family or their company, but as a beacon of what was possible when business prioritized ethics, sustainability, and the greater good. The challenges ahead were many, the work far from over. But as Alexander looked at his son, saw the determination and vision in his eyes, he knew that Blackwood Enterprises and the movement it had sparked was in good hands. A new dawn was breaking, not just for the Blackwoods, but for the world of business as a whole. And as Alexander Blackwood stepped into this new chapter of his life, he did so with the knowledge that the best was yet to come.